Let's meet for one last time. Dorothy Stratten, under the control of three men. Some words may be changed to abide by YouTube censorship. Research material includes The Killing of the Unicorn by Peter Bogdonovich, the movie Star 80, Civil Disobedience by Sybil Shepherd, the article Death of a Playmate by Teresa Carpenter, Gloria Steinem's two-part article A Bunny's Tale, and Playmate of the Year, the 80s. Dorothy Hoogstraten was born on February 28, 1960, in the Salvation Army Grace Maternity Hospital in Vancouver, British Columbia, to Simon and Nellie Hoogstraten. Her parents emigrated from the Netherlands and had two children after Dorothy, a son named John Arthur in 1961 and a daughter named Louise in 1968. The neighborhood Dorothy grew up in was a lower working class rough area of East Hastings and Vancouver called Coquitlam. It was referred to as a podunk town, a term for a small, isolated, and insignificant town or rural area. Her father left the home for another woman when Dorothy was 3 or 4 years old. When she turned 8, her mother Nellie married a violent man who gave Dorothy a bloody nose and broke her brother's arm in a rage. Nellie left her second husband with her 3 children and no means to support them. Dorothy was left to care for her younger siblings while Nellie worked menial jobs to support them. She would later attempt nursing school. Growing up, Dorothy never felt attractive and turned to writing poetry by the age of 14 as a way of communicating her feelings. She thought of herself as plain with big hands. She had an unhappy childhood where she stayed in her room as a teenager and started smoking. In many ways, Dorothy was like any other teenage girl. She was sensitive, curious, and kind. She loved animals. She was insecure and anxious to grow up. She wanted to do something with her life, like landing a secretarial job, and she wanted to find happiness. And probably she wanted to find love. She wrote to 2 of her friends, "Remember the fine times of the past, but bring forth finer times of the future, and think not of what we are missing, but what we are gaining." And maybe like many teenagers, she not only had dreams, but also nightmares, and she frequently had death on her mind. A foot meets the pavement for a moment. The remains of a lowly earthworm, whose life was terminated in the creation of a footprint, dries up slowly. At its journey's end, a foot dries up, slowly in a coffin only to be transformed into soil by a lowly earthworm. At the age of 14, she was hired by the local Dairy Queen, which she thought was great at first. But then she turned 15, then 16, then 17, and 18, and she was still working there in her little red uniform and her hair in pigtails. At the age of 16, she had developed an ulcer. Eventually, Paul Snider walked into the same fast food establishment with a companion where Dorothy was working and changed their lives forever. Paul Leslie Snider was born on April 15, 1951 in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, to Jewish parents David Snider and Evelyn Corinne Snider. His siblings were Penny Sharon Snider, born in 1948, Randall Martin Snider, born in 1954, and Jeffrey Snider, born in 1956. One source said he was an orphan, but in truth his parents divorced when he was 7, and he quit school after the 7th grade at age 14 to work as a leather cutter during the day in his father's sweatshop. He grew streetwise and learned how to find women and manipulate them into working for him. For a time, Snider was the successful promoter of automobile and cycle shows at the Pacific National Exhibition. In LA, he put on the California Trucking and Cycle Show at the Convention Center. Photographer Howard Kobe met him while he was tooling around in a van designed by George Barris, creator of the Batmobile, spreading the word about the trucking show. Paul claimed he invented the bikini contest and also advertised wet t-shirt contests. His shows were popular, but legitimate enterprises didn't bring him enough money to support his expensive tastes, and he spent too much money on himself. He wore mink, drove a black Corvette, and flaunted a bejeweled Star of David around his neck. About town, he was known as the Jewish pimp. Among the heavy gang types in Vancouver, the Rounder crowd, Paul Snider was regarded with scorn, a punk who always seemed to be missing the big score. He never touched the recreational substances trade, said one Rounder who knew him then. Nobody trusted him that much, and he was scared to death of recreational substances. He finally lost a lot of money to loan sharks, and the Rounder crowd hung him by his ankles from the 30th floor of a hotel. He had to leave town. Bogdanovich wrote Paul had a car show in the summer of 1978, but he became involved with the girlfriend of a local mobster, and he used some of the mobster's money to pay for her chess job. When the mobster found out what Paul had done, he hung him by his ankles out of a 30-story window until Paul gave him all of his money. Snider split for Los Angeles, where he acquired a gold limousine and worked his girls on the fringes of Beverly Hills. He was enamored with Hollywood's dated appeal and styled his girls to conform with the 1950s notion of glamour. At various times, he toyed with the idea of becoming a star, or perhaps even a director or a producer. He tried to pry his way into powerful circles, but without much success. At length, he gave up pimping because the girls weren't bringing him enough income. One had stolen some items and had, in fact, cost him money. And when he returned to Vancouver sometime in 1977, Snider resolved to keep straight. For one thing, he was terrified of going to jail. He would unalive himself, he told a girl, before he would go to jail. Paul Snider was also an avid reader of Playboy magazine. In addition to ogling the centerfolds, he paid attention to the articles, and when he saw that the magazine was offering a $25,000 reward for the discovery of an unknown girl next door type to pose for the 25th anniversary edition, he went on a prowl. Paul never waited for an opportunity. He actively sought it out. In late 1977, Paul Leslie Snider entered the Dairy Queen and first met Dorothy. There she was, quietly taking burger orders and avoiding eye contact in all of her fast food glory. Dorothy was only 17 to his 26. She had a high school boyfriend whom she had been with for a year, and she said the relationship was an unhappy one for her. She wrote about the experience later in her life. Sometimes we get along really well, and then he would ruin it by dragging me to the bedroom. I dreaded that so much, but I felt I owed it to him. Sometimes I thought that's all he wanted from me, because he used to get angry when I refused him. I thought Smex, was the most animalistic and beastly thing ever invented. Steve never pleased me. I dreaded the end of the night when I had to give myself up to him. It was sort of like a game I kept losing, and that was how I lost. Dorothy had also seen her mother in unpleasant experiences with men, and there must have been a part of her that assumed the unhappy relationship with Steve was natural. She thought she was frigid, and she was the problem. After her boyfriend destroyed a Christmas present it had taken her months to pay for, she was open to the advances of a paternal Paul who was nearly 9 years her senior. What he saw in Dorothy was a tall, leggy girl with a slender waist and the body of a model, except, of course, for her large chest. When Paul told her she was beautiful, she unfolded in the glow of his compliments and was infected by his ambitions for her. He had tried to promote other girls as playmates, notably an exotic dancer in 1974, but without success. He had often secured recycled playmates or bunnies to work his auto shows, and had seen some get burnt out on Smex in the white lady, nose candy. Often their careers went nowhere due to poor management. Paul believed as her boyfriend slash promoter slash producer slash pimp, they're often one and the same, he could help Dorothy become a success. He bought Dorothy a beautiful gift for her 18th birthday on February 28th, 1978, and he spent money on a special evening just for her. Before Paul, her idea of dating was going to the movies and out to get pizza with a boy, just like any teenage girl. He seemed so worldly to her. Dorothy only knew she felt privileged to be with him and assumed he worked just as a promoter, a producer. He was brash and lacking in finesse, but he appealed to her, probably because he was much older and streetwise. He offered to take charge of her life, and at the time she thought that was nice. There had never been enough money to buy nice things, and now Paul bought her clothes. He gave her a topaz ring set in diamonds. Dorothy could escape her troubled home life by hiding out at his expensive apartment with skylights, plants, and deep burgundy furniture. He would buy wine and cook dinner for her. Afterwards, he'd make drinks and play the guitar for her. She must have thought she was in love. Snider dealt gingerly with Dorothy's inexperience and broke her in gradually. It's what we know now as the lover boy technique human traffickers and Romeo PIMPs used to create a false romantic relationship in order to exploit victims, typically young women and girls, for financial gain or sexual exploitation. The lover boy acts as a charming, caring, and protective partner, slowly building trust and emotional dependency before transitioning into an emotional A-worder who coerces the victim into selling her body for money. Peter said the Hoogstraten family didn't approve of Paul. Maybe. It's not like her mother, in particular, knew the difference between a good man and a bad one. He often bought flowers and presents, and it's possible Dorothy had a romantic fantasy of Romeo and Juliet with their relationship. Either way, she was old enough to make her own decisions, and Paul became an important part of her life. In Vancouver, 1978, Dorothy wrote a poem called A Walk by the Ocean. The dissolution of a raindrop evolves into the creation of a rainbow. The mystery of nature, a seed given birth to life, a word given birth to love. Paul escorted Dorothy to her graduation dance at Centennial High School in Coquitlam, British Columbia. Surely he must have stuck out, a 27-year-old in a sea of teenagers. He was easily old enough to be a teacher. Paul bought Dorothy a ruffled white gown for the occasion, and later they went to a German photographer named Ew Meyer for her first professional portrait. About a month later, Snider called Meyer again, this time to do an unclothed shooting at Snider's apartment. Meyer arrived with the hairdresser to find Dorothy a little nervous. She was shy at first and modest, but she fell quickly into playful postures. He was the same photographer who took her photos in high school. Those early photos would later be used in an article for the Village Voice. Although Bogdonovich wrote Dorothy was crying and forced to take her clothes off, people who knew Dorothy then said otherwise. She was eager to please, recalls Meyer. I hesitated to arrange her chest, thinking it might upset her, but she said, do whatever you like. Meyer hoped to get the $1,000 finder's fee that Playboy routinely pays photographers who discover playmates. But Snider, covering all bets, took Dorothy to another photographer named Ken Honey, who had an established track record with Playboy. Honey had at first declined to shoot Dorothy because she was underage and needed a parent's signature on the release. She was 18 at the time, and Canada's age of consent was 19. Peter and other sources claim Paul forged Nellie's signature on the papers while she was on vacation for 3 weeks in Europe. That was not true. Dorothy, who was reluctant to tell anyone at home about the undressed posing, finally broke the news to her mother and persuaded her to sign. She assured her mother what Paul also told her, that she wasn't selling her body, it was artistic. Honey sent those set of shots overnight to Playboy, and Marilyn Grabowski immediately brought the photos to Hugh Hefner. Hugh Hefner was born April 9, 1926, in Chicago, Illinois, to an accountant and a schoolteacher originally from Nebraska. He served 2 years in the United States Army as a writer and graduated from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in 1949 with a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and a double minor in creative writing and art. He also had some classes in sociology and quit his job with Esquire magazine in 1952 after he was denied a raise. Hugh Hefner began his so called lifestyle magazine for young single men, originally called Stag Party, in December 1953 with photos of Marilyn Monroe as the first Playmate centerfold. He brought the photos from a photographer who paid Marilyn to pose without clothes for a 1949 calendar. She never signed an agreement with Hefner to use the photos as they were purchased from a third party. Hefner had been arrested for promoting obscene literature in the 60s, and the trial resulted in a hung jury. He said he knew himself as a smexual, liberator, and he played some significant part of the social values of the time. Peter Bogdonovich pointed out that an interview with Jimmy Carter may have helped the president win the election. He said Hefner had gone from kingpin to kingmaker. Hefner referred to himself as a civil rights warrior, a defender of the First Amendment, and an unlikely feminist. He said, I was a feminist before there was such a thing as feminism. His idea of feminism stemmed from his support of sexual liberation, reproductive freedom, and the dismantling of the 1950s social Puritanism. Arguing these advances liberated women from traditional restrictive gender roles. Hefner framed his Playboy platform as empowering women to embrace their independence of or from marriage and motherhood. He said he loved women. He certainly loved looking at women, and he loved making money off of women. He did seem to make the connection that the liberations meant for women seemed to really benefit men who wanted smex without attachments. Hefner threatened to sue a journalist when she called him a PIMP. Defending her position, she argued that he was a man who bought and sold women to other men, and he was able to sell his female flesh peddling as acceptable to the masses. He made, corn, legitimate and acceptable. His critics said Hefner managed to convince many women that not only was taking off their clothes for men's pleasure empowering, but a goal in itself. It's the idea that images of women, the women themselves, exist just for the pleasure of men. His idea of liberation was convincing women that intimacy without any emotional attachments was somehow rewarding to them. This is exactly how PIMPs, break in their victims, the women who do the work for them, by convincing them that they can use their bodies to service men and not feel anything themselves. Hefner told them his corn, was artistic. Is corn really artistic? To be considered artistic, a work has to have or reveal creative skill in the work. There has to be proficiency and ability in the skill and appreciation in the message of the work, even if it isn't aesthetically pleasing. What is the artist's intent? What is the quality of the work? What is its purpose? Hefner believed his Corn was an exploration of desire and of the beauty of women's bodies. His critics believed Playboy was a commodity of women's bodies designed for arousal and profit. It was entertainment that made him very rich. In 1978, Hefner was busy looking for the perfect woman he believed would represent the 25th anniversary Playmate. He was looking for a tall blonde with a big chest, small waist, and a generous rear. Of course, she had to be beautiful, but innocent looking. That was very important. Candy Loving led the race, but she was brunette in her mid-20s and married. Hefner was still hoping a dream woman was out there waiting to be discovered. Dorothy arrived at the Playboy Mansion 2 days after they saw her photos. Hefner told Honey he wanted to see her as soon as possible. By then, Dorothy was working at BC Telephone, a job she had just started that June. She told the company she would be gone for a couple of days on a modeling assignment. Honey was sent a finder's fee, and on August 13, 1978, Dorothy flew to Los Angeles for a test shot. Sources said it was the first time she had ever been on a plane. She had traveled to Europe when she was very young, and they must have traveled by boat. On the European trip her mother Nellie took at the time, it's assumed she also went by boat again since she was gone for 3 weeks. Dorothy arrived at LA International Airport and she was taken by limo to the Playboy building on Sunset Strip. Dorothy was given a few glasses of white wine to relax, then pose for some photos. She was then taken to the mansion. Paul encouraged her to write about her experiences for a book titled Revelations of a Playmate. She wrote 2 chapters, or about 30 pages, and stopped. Peter Bogdonovich told her later to do the same thing, but she refused. She said she had no interest in writing about it. After she was gone, he found out about her earlier attempt and how both he and Snider had the same idea. There was something special about Dorothy Hoogstraten that the camera was able to capture. There was something about her that was once seen in actresses from the 1950s, in particular Marilyn Monroe. Both women were feminine, sexual, vulnerable, and beautiful. Her test shots were superb, placing her among the 16 top contenders for the 25th anniversary Playmate. In Dorothy's photos, she conveyed a mixture of innocence and eroticism. She was exactly Playboy's type. She looked like a virgin waiting to be defiled. But she was naive and inexperienced. She was not ready to handle the rounds of publicity necessary for a playmate. Although she lost out to Candy Loving, Dorothy was runner up and she was eventually named Playmate of the Month for August 1979. The Playmate of 1980 was possible too. That gave her time to learn how to be more media savvy. While other playmates required cosmetic surgery on their chests or had scars, Dorothy was nearly perfect. There was a patch of adolescent acne on her forehead and a round birthmark on her hip, but nothing serious. Her most troublesome flaw was a tendency to get plump, but that was controlled through a strict diet and exercise. The only initial change Playboy deemed necessary was trimming her shoulder length hair and eventually dyeing it platinum blonde. Both Dorothy and Marilyn had a similar dark strawberry blonde colored hair and full lips. The cumbersome last name Hoogstraten became Stratton, just as Marilyn Monroe changed her name from Norma Jean Mortensen. Hefner had to have seen the similarities in the two women. He had an obsession with blonde movie stars. He loved old Hollywood films and had weekly screenings of the classics. He said they were the major influence in his life. He wanted desperately to be included with the Hollywood dream makers and create films that would be adored for generations. However, Hefner's foray into features had been a dismal failure. Playboy produced Macbeth in 1971 with Roman Polanski as director, and Polanski said himself, the audience laughed when they saw Playboy listed in the credits. Other films like the 1973 The Naked Ape bombed at the theaters, and The Third Girl from the Left was a made-for-television drama starring Kim Novak and Tony Curtis. The Crazy World of Julius Roeder, released in 1974, was also a bomb. Hefner was simply seen as a host with an endless stream of women making up his harem in the Playboy Mansion. That, of course, brought an endless stream of famous men as guests to the strange world of Playboy. Hefner really catered to all kinds of celebrities. There were sports stars, Hollywood stars, political, and intellectual types. Now, who does that remind us of? Sounds very familiar. They were invited to his parties and played his games, but they did not respect him. That's what Dorothy meant for Hefner. Through her, he could possibly become a star maker. Playboy photographers had been so impressed by the way Dorothy photographed that a company executive called Agent David Wilder of Barr Wilder Associates. Wilder, who handled the film careers of other playmates, agreed to meet Dorothy for coffee. A quality like Dorothy Stratten's comes by once in a lifetime, said Wilder, with an exaggeration that comes naturally after a tragedy. She was exactly what this town likes, a beautiful girl who could act. Or at the very least, she was working very hard with an acting coach to learn how to act. Dorothy was very willing to work with Playboy to be what they wanted her to be. Her youth and inexperience made her very malleable. She felt honored she was chosen by Playboy. She never thought of herself as their type. She didn't realize how beautiful she really was. The few days she claimed she needed off from work at BC Telephone Company was extended until she was unable to keep her job. There was no going back for her. Whatever opportunity she had in LA would be her future. She had not told her brother and sister she left for Playboy and only said it was a modeling job. Her mother was still away in Europe. In her memoir, she wrote, "My visit extended to 3 weeks. Paul was getting more and more nervous every day. He would call the photographer in Vancouver and yell at him. He would call the photographer in LA and ask him questions. He called the studio and he called the mansion 3 or 4 times a day. He couldn't figure out why I was staying so long." Later, she wrote, "Sometimes I cried before I went to sleep. A lot of men were entering my life all of a sudden, and a lot of them wanted me. No one was ever pushy or forceful, but talk can be very powerful, especially to a mixed up little girl. And I was getting confused. I was getting lonely, and I was getting depressed. One night there was a huge pajama party. I got drunk and danced and ate and had a good time. The next day I was in bed sick. Paul called me in the morning about 10 o'clock. I told him I had to see him, and it was so important that he fly down. He understood. I met him at 5 p.m. at the airport, and we stayed at a hotel for the weekend. I knew I had to see Paul because I felt something was starting to go wrong. I knew I could only be strong for a certain amount of time, and I was getting too depressed. In trying to get over my depression, I had to think of Paul less and start enjoying myself with other people. I knew that wouldn't work either. Eventually, Dorothy moved in with Patrick Curtis, a film producer and press agent previously married to Raquel Welch, promoter, producer, PIMP. He said he was a platonic friend and supporter for Dorothy. It was his apartment, and he gave her a key to come and go as she pleased, presumably whenever she needed a break from the mansion. When Hefner found out Dorothy was living with Patrick Curtis, he asked Curtis what his intentions were, and he explained they were just friends. Hefner didn't feel it was right for Dorothy to live with him. It didn't suit the image of the Playboy bunny, particularly if she didn't want to stay at the mansion for free. But Dorothy didn't have enough money to rent an apartment of her own. Paul by then had planned to move to LA to be with her, and they were together to attend the Playboy Halloween party there in 1978. She was only allowed to work for Playboy due to an alien status and her visa restrictions. In the meantime, she was given a job as a bunny at the Century City Playboy Club, where she walked around in high heels and a Playmate uniform serving drinks to regular customers. It was not a glamorous job. Feminist Gloria Steinem went undercover for 11 days in 1963 to expose the realities of working as a waitress at Hugh Hefner's New York Playboy Club. A classified ad looking for attractive young girls claimed they could earn $200 a week, a large sum then. Now it would be somewhere around 2,500. Steinem, under the fake name Marie Oakes, went through 2 interviews, a complete physical examination, including blood work, a gynecological exam, and a chest x ray, and a tryout in a bunny costume before she was hired. She was told they didn't want the girls to have a background. No men in their personal lives were allowed to meet them at or near the club. They needed to fit the bunny image of an available young woman, or as they were frequently called, girls. Gloria's bunny outfit was too tight by 2 sizes. She could barely breathe in it, and it left her hip bones exposed, along with most of her butt. Like other bunnies, she had to stuff her chest to make it look full enough. Matching bunny ears, a white tail, a tiny collar, starched cuffs, and 3-inch high heels completed her look. The girls were charged each day for their costumes' cleaning and upkeep. They also paid for their black tights and were charged demerits for not having the perfect costume together. Although Steinem was given 2 costumes, she had to pay for shoes dyed to match them. She also had to pay for long fake eyelashes and her own makeup. Although she was told bunnies did not date the customers, there was exemption for what they called the number one key holders, basically the big spenders. One girl was fired for not going out with a number one key holder. The bunny Bible she was given encouraged her to sell drinks to her customers, and it said bunnies were never allowed to date the customers. There was even a detective agency employed to make sure that didn't happen. Basically, Hefner's license to operate a business was in jeopardy at any sign of women selling their bodies for money. However, bunnies must always remain happy and cheerful while they were on the job. As for the pay, they received minimum wage working in New York, which was about $500 in today's money. The club took 50% of their tips at a minimal amount each day they worked, which in today's money would be about $300, and the percentage decreased as the tips increased, but rarely, if ever, did the girls make past that minimum amount a night. They could keep cash tips, but would be fired if they were caught asking for that. They could earn merits, which they could use to pay back their demerits. She received a meal ticket, which gave her 1 free meal per shift on her half-an-hour lunch break. The number one key holders were given special privileges, including private information about the bunnies. The young women were also encouraged to see them outside the club, but said they would not be forced. Gloria was told she didn't have to do anything she didn't want to do, but she was leery. A busy night at the club had 4,000 mostly middle-aged businessmen in attendance. There was just over 100 young women working as bunnies when Gloria was there, and many were new. There was a high turnover, and sometimes they stole each other's tips. The advertising for the bunnies stated most of them were college girls taking classes through the week. Gloria found maybe 3 or 4 who fit the profile. One girl was a model, and after 3 months as a bunny, she was ready to just get married. There were claims bunnies moved into the entertainment industry as models and actresses, but no one knew who they were. There was even a Playboy theme with part of the lyrics. If your boy is a Playboy, loosen your control. If his eye meanders, sweet goose your ganders, just one more ornery critter who goes for the glitter. So if you've been overheating your oven, just remember that the boy is a Playboy, and the gal that makes a fireside loving man of the boy gets him to stay. Never talks to him but sweetly when he plays it indiscreetly. Never takes the play completely away. Gloria worked one night from 7:30 p.m. to 4 a.m. without a break, and her feet were so swollen she couldn't even get her sneakers on. She almost made the minimum amount for the 50% percentage tip the club received, and she lost 5 pounds in one night. As for the bunnies, they did date men they met at the club. Sometimes they were even given money by them, but nothing came from these hookups. These young women were treated as call girls and disposed of easily. Gloria wrote a 2-part article exposing the work conditions at the Playboy Club, and although it led to some changes being made, like the complete physical exam, men still saw the bunnies as smexual, you know, fair game. By the time Dorothy was working at the Playboy Club, she met Dr. David Kushner, and Peter wrote he made the usual moves on her. Peter accepted any man would hit on Dorothy. As a matter of fact, he not only seemed to expect it, but appreciated it. Sybil Shepherd said something similar about Peter in her book. She said he got the thrill from watching men staring at Sybil and wanting her, only to walk up behind her and claim her as his. Later, Kushner would move in with Dorothy and Paul and became a confidant of Paul's. By the end of October 1978, Peter met Dorothy at the Playboy Mansion just before the annual Playboy Halloween party. He had just recently returned from Singapore, where he directed a movie called St. Jack with Playboy as producer. He claimed he had been involved with a string of women after breaking up with Sybil Shepherd, which technically did not happen until Peter went to Singapore. He was introduced to Dorothy by Candy Loving. Candy had won the 25th anniversary contest, with Dorothy being the runner up and a centerfold for next year. Peter thought Dorothy was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen and believed she should have won. He claimed he was casting a new picture and no doubt implied she would be considered if she contacted him. Men who visited the Playboy Mansion used that line a lot. He wrote his name and phone number on a piece of paper and handed it to her. She just smiled a radiant smile at him, and he was interested in the freshness of her. Dorothy didn't know about Peter, never heard of him or his movies, but she was smart enough to go asking around about him. They gave her the rundown about Peter Bogdonovich. Peter's father was a talented and eccentric Serbian painter and pianist, while his mother came from a prosperous Jewish family in Vienna who had many relatives perish in the Holocaust. She escaped to America in 1939 while she was already pregnant with Peter. He was born July 30th, 1939, and began his career in acting, studying under Stella Adler before working as a film journalist. He was then hired by Roger Corman to work on a few low-budget films before his feature film debut, The Last Picture Show, was released in 1971 to both critical and box office acclaim. The screenplay was co-written by Larry Jeff McMurtry. It was based on one of his novels. The movie cost $1.3 million to produce and made $29.1 million in theaters. Peter was considered an auteur director who became as big a star as the movie stars he directed. He didn't consider himself a craftsman, but an artist. He believed his work wasn't for entertainment but for art. A handful of auteur directors were creating cultural phenomena during that time: Robert Altman, Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Hal Ashby, and of course Bogdanovich. Model Sybil Shepherd was spotted on the cover of Glamour magazine and eventually hired to play J.C. Farrow, a spoiled and manipulative young woman. Both Peter and Sybil claim in their books that Peter was the one to discover Sybil, but other sources said it was Polly Platt, Peter's wife at the time, who was the one who found Sybil when she spotted her on the cover of a woman's magazine. Peter and Polly married when they were very young in 1962 and had two daughters together. She worked as a film producer, production designer, and screenwriter with Peter during the marriage and after they were divorced. Regardless of who first spotted Sybil, it was Peter who fought for her to have the job, and it wasn't because she was a great actress. Sybil started out as a beauty queen who moved into modeling. She said in her book every model she knew was taking acting lessons, and the Hollywood guys she met were creeps. Still, she went to Peter's suite facing Central Park dressed in the way she thought would get his attention for the audition. She wanted to look disinterested but intelligent, so she wore denim jeans with a denim jacket, Dr. Scholl's wooden sandals, and she carried a paperback book. He asked her what she was reading, and she said Dostoevsky. He said which one, and she said War and Peace. They laughed because, for people who don't know, it was Tolstoy who wrote War and Peace. She didn't know. Sybil was just playing a part for him. Sybil claimed she fumbled her response because she felt an immediate attraction to the director, who was married with children and 10 years her senior. She received $5,000 for 6 weeks of work, and she noted she could have easily made that in a week of modeling, but it was a good role in a feature film and could lead to more acting jobs. Sybil could and did transition to actress. She also had to agree to 2 nude scenes in the movie, something her then Italian boyfriend did not approve of. Peter coaxed Sybil into conforming to what he believed was the dream female lead, and soon he was crushing on her during the shoot. He told her he didn't know who he'd rather sleep with, her or the character she was playing. It was feelings she returned in earnest. They made plans to go to dinner while Polly was away, and he sang to her, which she found charming. When Polly returned, she knew the affair was happening, but she had hoped, like many trysts, it would simply end when the location affair lost its heat. One night she was eating dinner in a restaurant when she saw Peter and Sybil walk through the doors. Polly didn't want a confrontation, so she crawled out of the restaurant on her knees. Sybil said all of her life she had been told she could use her beauty, but even for someone as beautiful as she was, she said she never felt she was pretty enough. It's hard to believe there was ever a time when a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, tall girl with an ample chest could ever not be considered beautiful, but that's what she said in her book. Her look was becoming very popular in the 1970s, and nudity was more acceptable in society. A friend pointed out to her that once an actress appeared nude on film, the stills often fell into the wrong hands. She requested a signed affidavit from Bogdanovich and the producer that no stills would ever be printed. She continued to nag Peter about it until he snapped at her, "If you ever mention this again, I will never give you another piece of direction." She never did speak of it again and did what she was told. Peter and Sybil made no promises to each other, but he was sneaking out to phone her once he returned to his family home in Los Angeles. Polly finally told him if he couldn't stay away from her, then just go be with her. Later, the movie Irreconcilable Differences was produced based on their divorce. Peter had this need to educate Sybil on the arts, literature, film, artwork, areas he was very knowledgeable in. He expected the main woman he was with to be beautiful and young, but also very sophisticated. It was a Pygmalion dynamic between them. Peter sent Sybil to UCLA to watch a schedule of films by directors like Alan Duane and Frank Borgegi. To be his girlfriend, she was expected to take his tutoring. After Sybil moved to LA to be with Peter, they rented a furnished apartment on the Sunset Strip. They were not exclusive to each other and had a never cheat on me in the same city rule. Sybil said part of her attraction for Peter was other men were attracted to her. One affair Sybil had was with Elvis Presley. Playboy had offered money to Sybil since the last picture show to pose for them, but she always turned them down. 5,000 doubled to 10,000, and the price went up to 50,000, but she always refused. Then they figured out how to get her for free. They had a SMEX, in cinema issue at the end of the year, and Sybil's nude stills were used without her permission. She called a lawyer and sued. The case dragged on for years. Eventually, Hefner was willing to settle, but instead of asking for a lot of money, she asked for a book Playboy had under option called St. Jack that Peter would direct. They did not marry, although Sybil lived with him in the house he bought after his divorce, where there were 2 master bedrooms upstairs. Sybil later had her own apartment for her own space. She went to the Peter Bogdonovich School of Cinema. Each week, he'd mark the TV guide for films she should watch. At one party, a producer asked her who she was studying with in order to be an actress. She said nobody. "That's a mistake," said the producer with a sniff. "You better start soon because you need all the help you can get." Their next film together, Daisy Miller, bombed. So did At Long Last Love. He had success working with Barbra Streisand on What's Up, Doc, and with Tatum O'Neal in Paper Moon. Sybil had more success away from Peter in the movie Taxi Driver. By the age of 28, she began longing for a baby. She asked Peter, but he said not to bring up the subject again. He wasn't interested in another family. Sensing their relationship was slipping away, she flew to meet him on location in Singapore for St. Jack. Sybil was met by a beautiful Asian actress who lit up like Las Vegas when she saw Peter. Peter threw a crystal ashtray at Sybil during a fight, and their relationship was over. She left and told him to send her what he thought she should have from the 8-year relationship. He sent her property like books, a painting, a rug. Not much out of an 8-year relationship. The film Peter shot, called St. Jack, was based on the 1973 book Playboy owned and was about an American PIMP operating in Singapore. The budget for the film was $2 million, and it bombed in theaters when it was released in the spring of 1979. Playboy co-produced it. Peter had as many flops as he did hits, and he needed another success. His career depended on it. Dorothy told someone at the mansion she thought he was fake. She doubted he could do anything for her career. She threw the scrap of paper with his name and phone number away. As for Peter, he wrote he assumed Dorothy was taken, which she was. She had a boyfriend whom she would marry the next summer. Peter said they were both half right. Maybe he thought if Dorothy wasn't happy with Paul, that meant she really wasn't with him. With at least 2 women, Colleen Camp and Patty Hansen, Peter wrote he had tried to settle down but failed. He claimed his nature was to be monogamous. He lied. He cheated on his wife, Polly, and he cheated on Sybil. He pointed out that year he had been with multiple women, but only 2 were from the Playboy Mansion. Peter claimed he was sickened by group SMEX and was tricked into a compromising situation by a Hefner body and a woman. Peter wrote the men at the Playboy Mansion pursued women for smecks only and didn't even want a conversation with them. He claimed he was tired of visiting the Playboy Mansion by the time he met Dorothy, but Peter had a long history as a mansion visitor. He claimed his visits there were innocent. Apparently, he only went there for a game or two of pinball, some chit chat, and a sandwich or a movie, maybe to see a fight on closed circuit TV. He said he started talking to a 19-year-old teenager whom he thought was meant to be with Hefner later. She told him they were being watched, and Peter seemed to be naive about her concern. She asked him in private if posing for Playboy would help her break into the movies, and he told her it certainly would not. Then Peter did something very sleazy by offering to take her back to his home. He said they could talk unobserved. He offered to bring her back whenever she wanted. He sensed she was far more innocent than she acted, and he seemed to like that. He said she wanted to get her to trust him first and then talk her out of the Playboy idea. He said everyone in Hollywood considered Playboy Playmates glorified call girls. They had a shelf life of about 30 days until the next issue appeared. Playboy, contrary to the perception of aspiring starlets, is not a natural conduit to stardom. Most playmates who go into movies peak with walk ons and fade away. Those whom Hefner had tried most earnestly to promote have been abysmal flops. Both of Hefner's paramours, Barbie Benton and his one time favorite, Sandra Theodore, failed at acting. Peter said a mansion regular broke up their conversation, and when he went outside to meet the teenager at his car, Hefner came out with two men in his security team, claiming he had a date with a 19-year-old later that night. Peter said he was taking her for a ride and they would return in an hour, but she was being led back into the mansion as he spoke. Peter made a joke saying he thought he was a guest, and Hefner retorted, "I'm not that good of a host." Peter said the 19-year-old would go on to be a high-priced call girl in Paris, and many other Playboy bunnies didn't fare any better. Peter was sleazy, and as disgusting as the Playboy Mansion was, it was far more dangerous for these young, impressionable women to leave the mansion, with many playmates still teenagers. Peter said when he played Monopoly, he always ended up getting the bunny as his playpiece because he empathized with women and he wasn't close to men. Get real. He was hanging out at the Playboy Mansion and he wasn't to play those kind of games. Something would happen to a Playboy Playmate named Melanie Haller that brought into the open what powerful men in Hollywood have been doing to women for many decades. On the night of April 12, 1980, Haller attended a dinner party at the Southampton, Long Island home of producer Roy Radin. Radin was a show business promoter who packaged vaudeville shows and nostalgia tours in the 70s and early 80s. But just like Hefner, he wanted to get into movies and become a producer. Just so that we're clear, promoter, producer, PIMP. More often than not, they are all one and the same, just like Hefner, just like Snider. The 22-year-old Haller was introduced to Radin through photographer Ronald Sisman as she attended the party hoping to revive her career. She had appeared on the series Welcome Back, Kotter in its third season from 1977 to 78, and she had some small, uncredited roles in movies The Love Machine and The French Connection. She also appeared in the March 1980 issue of Playboy magazine, and as many women found out, it did nothing to help her get acting roles. The next day, on April 13th, she was found unconscious and bloody on a commuter train to Manhattan. She said she had been beaten and R-worded during the party, and the attack was filmed by Radin and others in attendance. Radin countered that Haller had willingly taken part in the S&M games. He was charged with menacing Haller, criminal possession of two substances, and illegal possession of a weapon. He pled guilty to the weapons charge and was sentenced to a $1,000 fine and 3 years of probation. His companion that evening, 43-year-old businessman Robert McKagy IV, pled guilty to assaulting Haller, and Judge James N. White imposed a 30-day jail sentence, along with 5 years of probation. The cameraman that night who caught the assault on film was later found unalived, along with his girlfriend. Radin would go on to produce the movie The Cotton Club and was the victim of an unaliving for hire at the age of 33. 4 people were eventually sentenced in his death and became known as the Cotton Club Unalivings. There were rumors he was involved in substance trafficking and the production of films where people are unalived or self-unalive for the entertainment of voyeurs. Voyeurs are commonly referred to as peeping toms, and they take pleasure in watching unsuspecting people engage in undressing and sexual activity, and that pleasure can enter into dark and disturbing directions. They can enjoy seeing the pain and distress in others. These movies are made for financial profit, and even if there is no sex during the scenes of unaliving, there is still sexual gratification involved. There were plenty of movie star studs hanging around the Playboy Mansion: Warren Beatty, Ryan O'Neal, and Tony Curtis. James Caan was also there, Robert Blake, O.J. Simpson, Jim Brown, and Bill Cosby. Quite a lineup. In a few years, Caan will be accused of punching, choking, and threatening to unalive a woman. Blake will be tried for unaliving a woman. Simpson will be tried for unaliving a woman. Brown will be charged with attacking a woman, and Cosby would be convicted of drugging and attacking a woman. Caan would settle. Blake would be acquitted. Simpson would be acquitted. Brown's charges will be dismissed, and Cosby's conviction will be overturned. There was not any justice for the victims of these men. But there was a lot of Smex talk amongst the men, particularly when Hefner bought a Smex chair he proudly displayed at the mansion. It may have provided inspiration for Snider to build his own Smex chair. Peter said Hefner and Patrick Curtis hated Paul on sight. Snider was not new to the Playboy circle. There were plenty of Paul Sniders who brought their wives or girlfriends to the altar of Hugh Hefner to bow and worship. Hefner and Snider were cut from the same cloth, but one was far more successful than the other. Hefner was also cultivated and civilized compared to Snider, but they were very much one and the same. Dorothy was the pin-up, and Paul and Hefner were the PIMPS. She worked long days with Playboy and rose early for exercise class. She had to be very thin for the Playboy standard, and so much about herself, her body, and her life was changing. Dorothy was soon looking for reasons not to go home to Snider, as it was becoming clear he was living off of her. She was surrounded by other men who were successful and interested in her, and Snider was not on their level. Snider was there for her to help her navigate her career, but she also had a whole other set of problems dealing with Paul. It was hard enough dealing with the men at the Playboy Mansion. Dorothy also confided there were women who were hitting on her too. In LA, in August 1979, Dorothy wrote the poem The Base of the Pyramid. It's here, everything, everything anyone ever dreamed of and more. But love is lost, the only sacrifice to live in this heaven, this Disneyland, where people are the games. Hefner by then had started filming women for their cable and videocassette operations. They went beyond what could be exposed in the photos they could publish, and the videos could be raunchier and more graphic. In early 1980, Linda Lovelace and Michael Grady published Ordeal, where she claimed Hefner wanted to see Linda have sex with a dog. He wanted to watch bestiality. Linda's husband slash promoter slash manager told her to have sex with a dog for Hefner's pleasure, and when that didn't work out, he violated her from behind in the jacuzzi. The jacuzzi would come up later in Peter's accusations that Hefner violated Dorothy. Dorothy was set up with an agent, David Wilder, and he had handled careers of other playmates. When Lorimar Productions wanted a playmate type for a bit role in Americathon, Wilder sent Dorothy. When Columbia wanted a beauty who could skate for Skate Town, Wilder sent Dorothy, who could skate like an ace. When the producers of Buck Rogers and later Galaxina asked simply for a woman who was so beautiful that no one could deny it, Wilder sent Dorothy. And once Dorothy got in the door, it seemed that nobody could resist her. During the spring of 1979, Dorothy was busy modeling or filming. One photographer recalled, "She was green, but she took instruction well. From time to time, however, she would have difficulty composing herself on the set. She asked a doctor for a prescription of Valium. It was the adjustments," she said, "and the growing hassles with Paul." Since coming to LA, Snider had been into some deals of his own, most of them legal but sleazy. His chief hopes rested with Dorothy. As soon as Paul learned of Dorothy's selection for Playmate, he, by Hefner's account at least, flew to Los Angeles and proposed. They did not marry right away, but set up housekeeping in a modest apartment in West Los Angeles. Paul had been working very hard on a project of his own. He had come up with a brilliant idea, that of an all-male nightclub act consisting of erotic beefcake dancers who wore skin-tight pants and white collars and cuffs and nothing else. Obviously influenced by the uniform Dorothy wore as a cocktail waitress at the Playboy Club, the white collar and cuffs were ripped directly from Playboy. It was Dorothy who recommended the uniform alterations to Paul. The Chippendale dancers were born. This act was sheer genius, and it's hard to believe that the notion had not been exploited earlier. Paul recognized that women had sexual appetites just as men, yet there were precious few outlets other than personal relationships that cater to those needs. The act in the club that showcased them was an instant success, but due to poor business skills, Paul found himself on the outside looking in when his investment partners cut him out completely out of the action. When his investment partners cut him completely out of the action. Dorothy was all he had now. It was part of Snider's grand plan that Dorothy should support them both. It was part of Snider's grand plan that Dorothy should support them both. He had a list of merchandise to tie to her image, and she was to be his main business. He reminded her constantly that the two of them had what he called a lifetime bargain, and he pressed her to marry him. Dorothy was torn by indecision. Friends tried to dissuade her from marrying, saying it could hold her back her career. But she replied, "He cares for me so much. He's always there when I need him. I can't ever imagine myself being with any other man but Paul." It's doubtful anyone else understood what Dorothy saw in Paul. Both came from broken homes and from poor backgrounds in Vancouver. They may have been trauma bonding. Paul also saw something in Dorothy before anyone else did. She felt she owed him for discovering her. Also, as a married woman, she may have been seen as less desirable to dirty old men hanging around the Playboy mansion. Dorothy and Paul were married in Las Vegas on June 1st, 1979, and the following month Dorothy returned to Canada for a promotional tour of the provinces. Paul did not go with her because Playboy wanted the marriage kept secret. In Vancouver, Dorothy was greeted like a minor celebrity. The local press, a little caustic but mainly cowed, questioned her obliquely about exploitation. I see the pictures as nudes, like nude paintings, she said. They are not made for people to fantasize about. Her family and Paul's family visited her hotel, highly pleased with her progress. The August issue was already on the stands, featuring her as a pouting nymph who wrote poetry. Her first film was about to be released. Dorothy was going to star in a new Canadian film by North American Pictures called Autumn Born. Since her unaliving, not much has been made of the film, probably because it contained unpleasant overtones of bondage. Dorothy played the lead, a 17-year-old rich orphan who was kidnapped and abused by her uncle. Dorothy was excited about the role, although she conceded to a Canadian reporter, "A lot of it is watching this girl get beat up." While Dorothy was being pummeled on the set of Autumn Born, Snider busied himself apartment hunting. They were due for a rent raise and were looking to share a place with a doctor friend, a young internist who patronized the Century City Playboy Club. They needed to take in renters to help make the ends meet. Dorothy was working, but she wasn't making a lot of money. Paul found a two-story Spanish-style stucco tract house near the 405 Santa Monica Freeway in West LA. There was a living room upstairs as well as a bedroom, which the doctor claimed. Paul and Dorothy moved into the second bedroom downstairs at the back of the house. Since the doctor spent many nights with his girlfriend, the Sniders had the house much to themselves. Paul had a growing obsession with Dorothy's destiny. It was, of course, his own. He furnished the house with photographs and got plates reading star 80 for his Mercedes. One source said it was a new car, another one said it was a used one. He talked about her as the next Playmate of the Year, the next Marilyn Monroe. When he had a couple of glasses of wine, he would say, "We're on a rocket ship to the moon." When they hit it big, he said, they would move to Bel Air Estates, where the big producers lived. Dorothy was made uncomfortable by his grandiosity. He was putting her, she confided to friends, in a position where she could not fail without failing them both. But all was not warm and fuzzy between the newlyweds, namely that everyone loved her and couldn't stand him. He would accompany her on publicity gigs and to parties, and it was always the same story. She'd be charming everyone with her little unassuming ways, and he'd be shadowing her like the stalker he was, embarrassing her with his ridiculous clothes and hustler demeanor. As her manager slash promoter slash husband, he provided the kind of cautionary coaching that starlets rarely received. He wouldn't let her smoke. He monitored her drinking, which was moderate at any rate. Paul smoked wacky tobacco, and there were rumors he liked the white lady nose candy sometimes. But Dorothy showed no interest in recreational substances except for Valium. Mainly, he warned her to be wary of men she met at the mansion, men who would promise her things, then use her up. Snider taught her how to finesse a come on, how to turn a guy down without putting him off. He also told her there were more important men she may sleep with to elevate her career, and he made a list of men for her. There were always rumors that Dorothy and Hefner had been together intimately. According to the bizarre code of the Playboy lifestyle, sleeping with Hefner was strictly a voluntary thing. It never hurt a career, but Hefner, with so much smecks at his disposal, would consider it unseemly to apply pressure. Of Stratten, Hefner said, "There was a friendship between us. It wasn't romantic. This was not a very loose lady." Hefner liked to think of himself as a father figure to Stratten, who When she decided to marry, came to tell him about it personally. She knew I had serious reservations about Snider, said Hefner. I had sufficient reservations that I had him checked out in terms of a possible police record in Canada. I used the word, and I realized the risk I was taking. I said to her that he had a PIMP like quality about him. Interesting how Dorothy would go to Hefner to talk to him about her possible marriage to Snider and confide in him like a father, but would do what he encouraged her not to do and marry her boyfriend anyways. It's doubtful he really thought of Dorothy as anything else but a commodity. For Hefner, it may have been more about business than personal. Yes, there were some playmates who were married, but Hefner preferred the illusion of his women to be available to men at all times. Marriage meant she belonged to one man and had dulled the shine on that apple. Dorothy was more sellable when she was young, perfect, pleasurable, and untouched. The marriage made her less appealing, even flawed. Apparently, she didn't care, and at 19, Dorothy married 28-year-old Snider. He helped her remember who she really was, and to not get lost in the glitter of Hollywood illusion where people are repeatedly chewed up and spit out by the system. He was a link to her past, her sanity, and who she really was. He was there before it all began, so he really must love her, right? When they were in LA after one heated argument, Dorothy wrote this to Paul. When storms are past and gone, shall gentle love succeed. I wish to ease a troubled mind. Sleep is the thing we need. With these few words I send my love. You will in this a question find. My question is without a doubt. Love is a question, find it out. But after the marriage, Dorothy found his touch revolted her. If she thought the marriage would save them, she was sorely mistaken. Not long after they exchanged vows, she wrote, I am lonely with 100 people treating me with the world's best of everything. The August issue of Playboy came out, with Dorothy on the cover, clutching a sheer open top to her cleavage, and suddenly the world knew who she was. The August 1979 issue of Playboy was the best-selling issue of the year. Hefner began grooming his protege for Playmate of the Year. The calendar turned over from 1979 to 1980, the year Paul's license plate promised a new star, and it looked like that promise might become a reality. Paul gave her a live white rat as a pet, but her feelings for him were waning fast. She didn't want to be intimate with him anymore, and weeks would pass before they made love. But even then she felt nothing for him. She was just going through the motions of a relationship. He helped nurse her through a sickness, and she was grateful for that, but she was a ticket to paradise for him. The marriage allowed him to stay in the United States for as long as they were together, and he would receive half of everything she made, something a manager would never receive. Like most Playmate husbands, Snider was held at arm's length by the Playboy family. He was only rarely invited to the mansion, which bothered him, as he would have liked more of an opportunity to cultivate a connection with Hefner. Dorothy attended the parties at the mansion, but she was never involved in the Playboy lifestyle. She noticed there were looser women who serviced Hefner's celebrity guests. Yet she moved into the circle of Hefner's distinguished favorites when it became apparent that she might have a real future in film. Dorothy's possibilities were made manifest to him during the Playboy roller disco and pajama party taped at the mansion late in October 1979. Dorothy had a running part and was tremendously appealing. A year later, after the initial meeting, Dorothy recognized Peter at the mansion and asked him if he remembered her. Of course he had, but she looked completely different from the fresh-faced Canadian girl he recalled. Her hair was ultra blonde, her nails were long and red, she was thinner, and her lips were painted red. She told him her name, and he asked if her hair was different. He said she looked around to see if anyone was listening to them and led him to the bottom step of the staircase to talk. He thought she was beautiful, despite the gaudy makeup and dyed hair. Dorothy told him about the leading role she had in the small Canadian film called Autumn Born. She was worried about the scenes requiring nudity, but once she agreed to do the picture, she would be able to control the nudity, and it would be more gratifying than the nude posing she did for Playboy. Peter asked her if the film was any good, and she told him she didn't think so. None of the people involved seemed to know what they were doing. Peter watched the film years after her death, and he said she was right. He said she was much thinner than she had been when he first met her, and her ribs were protruding out of her chest and back. Dorothy was 19 and a half at the time of shooting, and her skinny body made her look years younger. She told him she had bit parts in a couple of Hollywood features: Skate Town, USA, Americathon with John Ritter, an episode of Fantasy Island, and a Buck Rogers episode. She had an agent, and she was chosen as Playmate of the Year. She was getting ready for a new layout for Playboy, with her dressing up as blonde movie goddesses like Dietrich, Monroe, Bardot, Veronica Lake, and others. She asked him to stay at the mansion and have dinner. Hefner appeared with his girlfriend, Sandra Theodore, his girlfriend of the moment. She had been a Sunday school teacher, and Peter noticed her hair was also bleached, nearly white. He also noticed she looked very sad, and she would soon be traded in for another model. Peter asked Dorothy if she was staying for the movie, and she said she would call home and see if her husband was there. He didn't know she was married. Dorothy sat at a table where Peter could not find a seat, and he sat quickly in an adjoining alcove to find her again. He asked her if she was happily married, and she said she was having a few problems, but it wasn't her husband's fault. Had she had many boyfriends before she married? He pried. Dorothy shook her head. There had been only one, Steve. After they had been together for a year, she gave him a ring she paid off in 15 weekly installments for his Christmas gift in 1977. She presented the ring to him, and a week later he became jealous over other men's attentions toward Dorothy and smashed the ring with a wrench from the trunk in his car. It was the end of their relationship. Peter said Dorothy was so innocent that his heart went out to her. He wanted her, and he wasn't put off by the fact she was married. He kept asking her about her marriage, but he assumed since her answers were bland and evasive, it could only mean that she was unhappily married. He said some hidden turmoil was unmistakable. He said he was doing a movie in New York and maybe she could come read for him. She said she would love to. Peter was working on a script for They All Laughed by the summer of 1979. John Ritter went on to play the role Peter had hoped to play himself. In earlier drafts, it was about a man who pined for the girl he loved and lost because he wouldn't commit himself to marriage and children. It was a sad ending. Time Life agreed to finance the version for $7.5 million, despite Peter's failures. For months, Peter assumed Dorothy was thinking of him the same way he was thinking of her. He contacted her agent, David Wilder, who had connections with other Playboy Playmates. Peter believed Hefner would hope he could discover Dorothy the same way he had discovered other actresses, including Sybil Shepherd, who received solid reviews for the movie The Last Picture Show. They were both tall, blonde, blue-eyed 19-year-old women Peter did and possibly could mold again for their roles. They were both new to the business and needed help along the way. Maybe lightning could strike twice. Almost a decade had passed when Sybil was a 19-year-old ingenue and he was a 30-year-old married man with 2 children. By then he was a decade older. Dorothy was 19 and Peter was 40. He was a good 20 years older and still chasing a teenage girl. Wilder sealed the deal by telling Peter Snider was a real pain, no one liked the guy, and the marriage would not last. That was all Peter needed to hear. He had Dorothy meet him at his house for a reading, and he saw her briefly twice more at the mansion. He did not have time to talk to her the way he wanted, but he joined in on Hefner's Pajama Party TV special, as he did the year before, but claimed he didn't enjoy it. He saw Hefner standing next to Dorothy as the previous week's party footage was played to everyone and talking to her, and he wondered if they were having an affair. Hefner seemed to take a great deal of interest in her. He watched her on the screen and became entranced by her. Hefner led Dorothy out of the room, and Peter followed in the background. By the time he caught up with Hefner again, Dorothy was gone. He knew about the part Peter was offering to Dorothy, although Peter didn't seem to know what that part would really be. Hefner said he wanted it to emphasize Dorothy was more than a beauty. She had intelligence and real ability. The following day was a warm Sunday, and Hefner had the tennis courts converted into a roller rink. Peter would see Dorothy again for a brief exchange outside, and it was the last time they talked at the mansion. He caught her alone later and slid up behind her like the creep he was. He told her if she felt like talking, he would be with friends over on the cushions. She turned half away and said she was working, but she would try. She didn't. As Hefner skated around, he held Dorothy's hand and loud music played through the speakers. At the edge of the rink, Peter watched in silence until one of Hefner's friends walked over to where he stood. "She's quite something, isn't she?" he said to Peter. He nodded, then asked if Dorothy was with Hefner. "No," Hefner's pal said. "Once in a while," he said, "one gets by him." Peter was told again that she's married to a jerk, and Peter was wondering why so many people were repeating the same lines about Dorothy's life to him. Peter told him about the role, and he said he would talk to her about it. On November 1st, Dorothy walked into Peter's home for the first time. He remembered she wore a frilly white cotton dress that was almost transparent, with a large floppy straw hat and heels almost too high to walk in. She also had the red nail polish he detested. He had her read for a role of the secretary, but he eventually gave it to another actress. Later, he rewrote the script with a leading role for her that rivaled the leading actress played by Audrey Hepburn. Dorothy would also have to change her name for the Screen Actors Guild because someone was already using the name Dorothy Stratten. Wilder offered Dorothy R. Stratten. Paul offered Kristen Shields and wanted everyone to call her that. Peter thought it should be D.R. Stratten and called her that to her surprise. He used it at times in his book. They drank tea, then finished with a couple of cigarettes. Dorothy said her husband didn't like her to smoke, and it was probably why she chewed gum so often. She sneaked them when she could, and Peter said he also wasn't supposed to smoke. She had to leave for the Playboy studio, and he walked her to her '67 olive green Cougar. He wanted to see her again for more scenes, but really he just wanted to see her again. He leaned in to kiss her during one of their meetings. He said it was a light kiss on the lips, but she didn't respond. She just blushed. Dorothy was doing press for Playboy and signing autographs in cities like Dallas. He found out later in a Dallas nightclub, a fat, unattractive man had asked the playmates for a dance and they all refused, all but Dorothy. She danced with him, and he turned out to be a splendid dancer because he was a dance instructor. They danced together for most of the evening, and she thanked him for a wonderful time. She was at Peter's house again on December 7th. He didn't know her husband Snider was waiting for Dorothy outside his gates, but she knew. Peter claimed he just happened to have an ancient occult science book that related playing cards to one's birthday. His was on July 30th, and it was the Jack of Hearts, the symbol for certain personality traits and life patterns developed from astrology. Basically, a load of garbage, but Peter thought it was accurate. As Dorothy looked over his shoulder, then looked up her birthday on February 28th. She was the 10 of clubs. Peter explained his card never moved, but the cards that appeared around it represented the people who were important in his life in that year. For his 40th birthday, Dorothy's card was found on the left next to his, which he already knew and looked it up ahead of time to show Dorothy so she would know they were meant to be. Then Dorothy asked about Paul, which Peter had probably not predicted. He was the 6 of diamonds. That card was on the other side of Peter's to his right. So all three cards were in a row with Peter in the middle. He was astonished by that. She wanted to continue, so Peter turned to his age of 41, and both Dorothy's and Paul's card disappeared. Peter slammed the book shut. He walked her to the door, and he looked at her hand. He told her the lines in her palm meant she had been here before. She had an old soul, but she smiled like she didn't believe him. Then Dorothy informed him that her husband was waiting and she had to leave. Before the week was out, she returned to Peter's house, but this time she was alone. She wanted him to look at a script everyone was encouraging her to accept called Galaxina, a science fiction comedy. As she looked away toward the window, she began to cry, and he placed his arms around her. She told him she cried all the time, and Peter thought he was falling madly in love with Dorothy. There are usually two types of men who enter the worlds of women who work in the adult entertainment industry. These are men who want to use these women for smacks and power, and occasionally there are men who believe they can save or fix these women. It's called the White Knight Syndrome or the Savior Complex, a psychological pattern where individuals compulsively rescue others to meet their own emotional needs or boost their own self-worth. While often appearing to care, this behavior can be condescending, patronizing, or a form of control, sometimes creating unhealthy, codependent, and imbalanced relationship dynamics. The need to rescue often stems from a desire to be admired, a need to control the partner, or a way to avoid addressing their own personal issues. These individuals are often drawn to or create situations where a woman is a damsel in distress. It can lead to resentment when the saved person does not act as expected or tries to become independent. The rescuer often feels powerless without someone to save, while the partner can become reliant on them. Dorothy told Peter her lines in the Buck Rogers episode was dubbed because her reading was too soft and inadequate. He told her it wasn't her fault, it was the lines she had to repeat. She then told him Paul was demanding she sign papers giving him 50% of her earnings for life. All of her people were against it, and although Paul said he was her manager, usually managers get 15% tops. She felt Paul discovered her, but Peter told her she would have been successful as a model. She started to believe with Peter's influence, because he was manipulating her with specific questions to come to the conclusion he wanted, that Paul never loved her to begin with. Dorothy believed underneath all men were like Paul. Ford Modeling Agency had asked to send her out, but Hefner demanded she sign with his Playboy Modeling Agency. The old Chicago based agency was disbanded for numerous incidents of women selling their bodies for money. Under the Playboy agency, Dorothy would make $500 a day to work up to 16 hours, and there was no overtime pay. Other agencies paid up to 3 times that, and Peter pointed out a Smacks worker could earn double that in an hour. Playboy paid big sums to their writers, but paid the women in the magazines very little. And no, men really don't buy Playboy for their articles. Dorothy wanted to visit her family for Christmas, but Paul said they couldn't afford it. He didn't like her family, and they didn't like him. She sent Peter a big Christmas card from her and Blaine, someone in the movie circle they knew. He responded by serenading her when she went again to his home. He did the same thing to Sybil. Sybil was a generation older than Dorothy and found the singing charming. Dorothy was 2 generations away from Peter and was embarrassed by the whole scene. She flushed with embarrassment and walked behind him so he couldn't see her. He thought it was a sweet reaction, but really she probably did it to keep from laughing. As he walked her out to her car, there was a full moon, and he noticed a rainbow appeared around it, with small white clouds. He thought it was a sign for them. Peter saw his daughters, and Dorothy brought her 11-and-a-half-year-old sister with her the next time they met. She was forced by Wilder to take the part in Galaxina, but she and Peter continued to see each other before filming for his movie began. Dorothy wrote a poem to him about the night with the full moon. The moon encircled in a misty rainbow. Those who do not see it do not know it is there, and the answer for those who do, it's personal. Peter introduced Dorothy to his daughters at an ice skating rink when Dorothy wore towering high heels and a tight skirt. Peter said Paul made her dress that way. Later, they walked on the beach and kissed for the first time. Then he noticed someone taking pictures of them in the distance. Peter left to go to New York, and Dorothy sent him a card with the sky and sea and a dark silhouette of a woman leaping for joy. She signed it Love, L-U-V, Dorothy. Peter returned for a weekend in L.A., and he had Dorothy over to his house. They sat in front of the fire and kissed, but Dorothy wouldn't let it go any further. Then she had to leave. Blaine Novak and Peter had a fight over Dorothy. He said Hefner knew Peter liked blondes, and he thought he and Dorothy were being forced together so Hefner could get his movie star for Playboy. He pointed out the tricky situation getting involved with a married woman, and Dorothy was under contract for Playboy for a couple of years. Peter wrote he and Dorothy had a fight over it, and she thought it was over. He may have been angry because she would not let their relationship move forward past kissing. He was changing so much for her, yet she kept going home to her husband. Later, Peter called her and apologized. Dorothy told him Playboy had given her a puppy and they named it Marston, but the people at the Playboy studio didn't feed the dog when she was away and he died. She was heartsick over it. After her unaliving, Peter found out it wasn't the people at Playboy who unalived the dog. It was Paul. He poisoned the dog. There was a direct connection between domestic V, and animal A word. Victims of DV often have significant bonds with their pets, and often they report their animals have also been attacked or unalived. Animal A word is one of 4 significant predictors of who will likely use A-worded behaviors and tactics in future intimate partner relationships. On Valentine's Day, Dorothy, who Peter called Dr., sent him a poem, looking at life through a window, watching the pain, the forced smiles, a little bit of laughter, and life goes on, leaving no time to get off the world and rest until the very end, when time means nothing anymore, because then you have all the time in the world, forever and ever. Peter gave her a copy of the Arabian Nights with PB Loves Dr. written in code. He also showed her his master bedroom with 2 rooms, 2 baths, and 2 closets, where he expected her to live with him. They would start filming in a month. Dorothy admitted she made a mistake marrying Paul. She loved him, but she wasn't in love with him. She felt guilty getting married, and within a matter of months, she already wanted to leave. She admitted he was good to her. She said he cooked, and she came home cranky and exhausted from working all day, and she just went to bed. She ran out of excuses every 2 or 3 weeks and was intimate with him, but she didn't enjoy it. Peter told her there was nothing she could do about it. When the feelings left, they were gone. He told her she wasn't happy, and even if they hadn't met, she would have met someone else. Dorothy told him that he was the only person she would leave her husband for. Without warning, she sat up and announced she was able to turn off her emotions. She can be very hard and indifferent. It sounded like Dorothy may have had a history of SA in her childhood. Quite often, adults who survive that form of A word develop coping mechanisms to shut off their feelings. They have low self esteem and are people pleasers. She said she could stay with Paul and that would be her life. But why would she settle for less than what she could have? Peter asked. Dorothy was starting to see a cycle her mother was pulled into and she didn't want to follow. First there's Steve, then there's Paul, then there's Peter, then there's someone else. After that, then there will be someone else. She didn't want to end up like her mother. Dorothy told Peter he could leave if he wasn't serious about them, and he promised her it was the most important thing in his life. He also promised her if he grew tired of her that he wouldn't stay with her because he felt sorry for her. That was what she was doing with Paul. In the early hours, Dorothy wrote Peter another poem, A Thought in the Night, lying awake in wonderment at the simplicity of happiness and the complexities of foresights, which may never be, because the present will slip into the past, and then the future is now, where the past will never be, knowing the morning will bring a new day of love. Filming was scheduled to begin in late March in New York City. Paul wanted to come along, but Dorothy said no. He would get in the way, and at any rate, the set was closed to outsiders. Determined that she should depart Hollywood as a queen, he borrowed the housemaid's Rolls Royce and drove her to the airport. He put her on the plane in brash good spirits, then went home to sulk at being left behind. Dorothy checked into her hotel, the Wyndham, though only to keep up appearances. She was staying with Bogdanovich at his hotel, the Plaza, a do not disturb on the phone. The early days in New York for Dorothy and Peter were almost like a dream. They ordered room service at the Plaza, then walked at midnight to the bookstore. On weekends, Peter spent time cutting the picture by hand, and Dorothy brought him cookies as he worked late. The affair between Dorothy Stratten and Peter Bogdanovich was conducted in amazing secrecy, with only the cast and crew guessing they were together. In that regard, it bore little resemblance to the director's affair with Sybil Shepherd. Bogdanovich did not want the publicity that might result from a liaison with a 20-year-old woman married to a hustler. It was the first time I'd seen him in a number of months because he'd been in New York, said Hefner. He's talking about Peter Bogdanovich. He was very, very up, very excited about her and the film. I don't think that he was playing with this at all. I think it was very important to him. I'm talking about the relationship. He was concerned at that point because of what had happened to him and Sybil. He was concerned about the publicity related to the relationship because of that. He felt, in retrospect, as a matter of fact, that he had kind of caused some of it, and it played havoc with both of their careers for a while. Stratton, as usual, did not advertise the fact she was married. The crew knew very little about her, except that she showed up on time and seemed very earnest about her small role. She was cordial but kept her distance, spending her time off camera in a director's chair reading. With the help of makeup and hair consultants, her looks were rendered chaste and ethereal to diffuse her Playboy image. She was a darling little girl, said makeup artist Fern Buckner. Very beautiful, of course. Whatever you did to her was all right. Dorothy had headaches. She was eating very little to keep her weight down and working 12-hour days because Bogdanovich was pushing the project along at a rapid pace. While most of the crew found him a selfish, mean spirited megalomaniac, the cast by and large found him charming. He was particularly solicitous of Dorothy Stratten. Word spread around the set that Bogdanovich and Stratten were involved. They weren't hanging all over one another, said one crew member. It wasn't until the last few weeks, when everyone relaxed a bit, that they would show up together holding hands. One day Bogdanovich walked over to a couch where Dorothy sat chewing gum. You shouldn't chew gum, he admonished. It has sugar in it. She playfully removed the wad from her mouth and deposited it in his palm. Peter said Dorothy was scholarly and had graduated in the top third of her class. She once did a high school essay on homosexuality. She said it was okay, but it wasn't for her. She may have thought she was attracted to women because of the brutal relationship with Steve and the fact she didn't have intimate feelings for him in the way she thought she should. At one point, she thought about studying law and worked for a week as a stenographer in Vancouver, but found the evidence in violent crimes too disturbing. Peter's daughters flew in to visit him over Easter, and he said Dorothy had a fun time with them hiding Easter eggs around the suite for them to find, and the three of them were always laughing. That's understandable, considering they were close in age. The girls chose a big, disgruntled stuffed rabbit to represent Peter, and a small white rabbit to represent Dorothy. She went to a matinee alone while Peter was working, and she saw the Broadway version of The Elephant Man. She was fascinated by the story and went to the bookstore to pick up a factual study of John Merrick. He said Dorothy didn't flinch as she stared at the naked photos of Merrick's grotesquely shaped body, but at 5 paces away he couldn't watch. Peter was always looking over her shoulder, observing what she was interested in or what she was doing. It was really creepy. Through it all, the shadow of Paul was always in the background. He left messages at her hotel that her husband called, but she was rarely there, and the employees knew that. Dorothy told Peter that Paul wanted to buy a house so they could start a family together. She said she would buy him a house, but she wasn't going to have any children with him. Her management team told her not to buy the house since a split in the divorce would give him far less in the end. They bought the Mercedes, but it was only Paul who drove it. Peter thought the Playmate of the Year issue was just terrible. He compared it to Dorothy's first layout when she appeared much happier and herself in the photos. He said there was a look of desperation in her eyes. He made his opinion known to her, and the very impressionable Dorothy agreed. She thought her body had aged significantly. Early in 1979, she was overworked and worn out and became sick. She went to bed for 2 weeks and she lost a lot of weight. Her left chest shrunk smaller than her right side by a cup size. She explained there was always a difference, and no woman is completely symmetrical unless she is surgically altered. But after the weight loss, she could tell a big difference. So could everyone else. When they shot her for the photos, the editors managed to conceal the difference. Plus, there was one photo that captured her with her legs wide open. It was obvious to Dorothy that Peter didn't like the layout, and it was more than just the poor photo quality. He didn't like other men could see this young, beautiful, sweet woman, whom by then proclaimed her love for him, and he was obsessed with her. She said she wasn't a hypocrite, and she did it. Peter said she was pressured to do it. I still did it, she said. I'm not going to go around saying I don't like what they've done to me in Playboy, which was what Peter was trying to get her to do. He told her she didn't have to go on endorsing the magazine and promoting it. Yes, she did. That's what it said in her contract, Dorothy pointed out wisely. It was a 3-year contract, and she still had a year to go with unclothed pictures, movies, and promotion. She had refused some of the promotion work, and they were understanding of that. After all, they were allowing her to do this movie with Peter. She pointed out she was Playmate of the Year, and they already paid her $250,000 to do the work. She received a check for $25,000 as Playmate of the Year, and it was a raise from the usual $10,000 they paid their winning playmates. She was photographed with all of her gifts in February, and she said she cried when she saw it all. There was a luxury car, a fur, dresses, lingerie, jewelry, video equipment, cameras, computers, a brass bed, and a brass and rosewood bathtub estimated to be worth $80,000. But it was in gifts, Peter pointed out. It would be treated as income. The taxes would be heavy, about $80,000. Dorothy understood and said she didn't want most of the stuff anyways. She only liked the watch and the camera. Plus, the gifts were overpriced, and she would have to sell all of it just to pay off the taxes. Paul had hoped she could sell the gifts and get enough for a down payment on a home. Dorothy thought he just wanted a way to place a lien on her life. Peter kept harping on her about Hefner R-wording her in the jacuzzi, and she told him it didn't happen the way he pictured in his mind. He even said in his book it broke his heart to remember the protective way she had described her jacuzzi encounter with Hugh Hefner, a version she could only wish were true. Dorothy said he surprised her in the jacuzzi late one night and made an obvious pass. She told him that she was getting married and she wanted to be a good girl. And Hefner said she was a good girl and left her alone. Then he claimed in the same paragraph Hefner became more insistent after the night in the jacuzzi and banged on her door until she opened it to tell him to leave her alone. She had a boyfriend and planned to marry. Dorothy told Peter about James Caan, who asked her to come up to his room for a drink, but was met with another woman who was intimate with him right in front of Dorothy. She was angry and left the room, making it clear she did not want to be involved with something like that. Caan was not very nice to her after that. It seemed Peter wanted to know every detail of Dorothy's personal life. He wanted reassurance that she was as pure and virginal as sweet as he needed to believe she was. She told him about the men who hit on her and the way she spurned their advances. He found it unusual for a woman to strip for Playboy, yet she was very modest about exposing her body to him. How did she get through the photo sessions? Hate, she explained. She said she hated all those men so much, and her hatred was so strong, it gave her an invisible shield between herself and them. The hatred protected her. Dorothy wanted to keep their affair as secret as possible. She knew Paul had been unfaithful, but she didn't mind. It meant she didn't have to be intimate with him. Dorothy had a Playboy companion named Elizabeth Norris, and when she traveled to Montreal, she blabbed to her about her involvement with Peter. Peter was concerned Norris wasn't a friend to Dorothy, but an employee to Hefner, and she would report back to him. Paul Snider was calling the East Coast, where he detected a chill in Dorothy's voice. She would be too tired to talk. He would say, "I love you," and she wouldn't answer back. Finally, she began to have her calls screened. Dorothy went to Vancouver on May 10th for her mother's next marriage, and she wrote to Paul before she left asking for space in the relationship. He flew to Vancouver to meet her there and was very angry. Playboy offered to provide her with a bodyguard, but she declined. She met Paul, and over her objections, he checked them into the same hotel. Later, each gave essentially the same account of the encounter. She asked him to loosen his grip. "Let the bird fly," she said. They argued violently, then they both sank back into tears. According to Snider, they reconciled and made love. Dorothy never acknowledged that. That night he took her to a club where he put her on display while he collected $1 apiece for signed, glossy photos. Then Dorothy pulled a very deliberate move to test how much her husband really loved her. She later told a friend she had offered to leave Hollywood and go back to live with him in Vancouver, but he didn't want that. He didn't really care about her. He cared about what he would get from her. In the end, Dorothy cut her trip short to get back to shooting. She had time to attend her mother's wedding, and Nellie asked Dorothy to cover herself up during the ceremony. She was wearing a revealing gold lame dress with spiked heels and too much makeup. Peter blamed Paul for her wardrobe choice because he wanted to see Dorothy as pure and sweet and virginal. He couldn't comprehend that Dorothy was a very young woman expressing her sensuality in a similar way she had seen other women do at the Playboy Mansion and in LA. She did not belong in working class small town of Vancouver anymore. She also did not like the man her mother married, and the marriage would not last the year. Paul threatened to leave for Hawaii and to never speak to her again. Peter said let him go, but Dorothy didn't want him to leave in such anger. She wanted them to end as friends. She believed if it weren't for Paul, she wouldn't have the opportunities she had, and she wouldn't have made it into Playboy, and she would not have met Peter. Peter said they would have met without Paul. Dorothy wrote a poem and let her mother read it. She liked it so much she copied it before giving it back to her. A tornado of thought sweeping the mind, waiting to close your eyes and open them again to a new beginning, or to start again on the right road. Life is a mysterious path which no two travel alike, and once the chosen path is taken, there is no turning back. Yes, there is an alternative sometimes, a crossroad somewhere in between, which takes you on a different journey. Will I be happy? Yes. For how long? I don't know. Dorothy brought one of Peter's daughters, Tony, with her when she returned home to see Paul, and introduced her as the director's daughter. Paul was rolling joints and offered one to the child as Dorothy gave him an angry look. Her clothes were still packed in suitcases, and she left quickly with Tony. When Dorothy appeared as a guest on the Johnny Carson show, Paul was with her and waited backstage. Carson asked her what part of the man's body she liked the best, and after a pause, Dorothy told him to stand up. After looking him over, she announced the chest as her favorite. She thought he was leading her to a vulgar answer for cheap laughs, but Carson had been very polite and funny. She looked stunning, and Ritter later called her to rave how sweet and charming she was. Dorothy told Carson it was sexier to wear some clothes rather than going nude. Carson retorted that she appeared sans everything in Playboy. She stumbled for a moment, then remembered her training through Playboy. Well, there's a difference, I think. Other magazines leave definitely nothing to the imagination. Dorothy had plugged the movie she was in and drilled the girl next door illusion by pointing out before she posed for Playboy she was working in Vancouver as a clerk typist at a phone company for 6 weeks. Peter claimed Dorothy fought back in the photo sessions that she felt were too explicit. Maybe she did. Maybe she was feeling her power with her growing stardom. Late in April, during a shooting break, she flew to Los Angeles for a flurry of appearances, which included a Playmate of the Year luncheon, where she seemed very comfortable with Hefner at her side, but not as much beside her husband. Peter thought her smiling at her boss was politically friendly, but not genuine. Maybe it was just what he wanted to see. When she thanked people who helped her in her career, like Hefner and the photographer, she did not mention her husband. It was bad enough that she had to be intimate occasionally with a husband she no longer cared for. His touch made her skin crawl, and she found herself protecting her chest area from him. She didn't want to do it anymore. It made her feel like a woman who sells her body for money. She became hyper aware and knew she was being followed. A man drove alongside her and wanted to meet with her later, but she refused. Only later did Peter find out that Dorothy had indeed been under surveillance by private detectives hired by Snider. Dorothy's managers and lawyers advised her to send Snider a letter informing him officially of the separation, but she preferred something less cold. Finally, she was convinced to write the letter and mailed it on June 26th. Snider then went to the bank with another woman and tried to convince the bank officers his companion was Dorothy. She opened a separate private account and he wanted access to it, but the bank refused. He had already drained their joint account of $15,000. He tried a little pathetically to groom another Dorothy Stratten, a 17-year-old checkout girl from Riverside who modeled on the side named Patty Lorman. He had discovered her at an auto show. Patty was of the same statuesque Stratten likeness, and Snider taught her how to walk like Dorothy, to dress like Dorothy, and to wear her hair like Dorothy. Eventually, she moved into the house that he and Dorothy shared, but she was not another Stratten, and when Snider tried to promote her as a playmate, Playboy wanted nothing to do with him. Peter offered to give Snider $50,000 to $100,000 to start his own business. If Dorothy agreed, it may have set Paul free, but she would be even further indebted to Peter. After Dorothy realized Paul had taken the money from their joint account and tried to break into her personal account, she said she would offer Snider half of what she had left, which was about $15,000, so she would offer $7,500. More than anything else, she wanted to be free at all costs, at any cost. She closed out their joint bank account and began advancing Peter money through her business manager. Buffeted by forces beyond his control, Snider tried to cut his losses. He could have maintained himself as a promoter or as the manager of a health club. He was an expert craftsman and turned out exercise benches which he sold for $200 apiece. On at least one occasion, he had subverted those skills to a more dubious ends by building a wooden bondage rack for his private pleasure. He began feverishly working on it in the garage of their home. It was a modified working bench equipped with leather straps with the ability to be adjusted to all sorts of bizarre sexual positions. He hoped to sell his invention to the Pleasure Chest, a kinky Smex and bondage shop on La Brea Avenue in West Hollywood, and market it to the Smex industry. The Pleasure Chest said thanks but no thanks. Apparently, the device was too BKT even for their standards. Another failed venture. But Snider didn't want to be a nobody. A big score was a project began a month or so before he and Dorothy were married. He had worked out a deal with a couple of photographer friends, Bill and Susan Lachaise, to photograph Dorothy on skates wearing a French cut skating outfit. From that day, they would print a poster that they hoped would sell 1,000,000 copies and net $300,000. After Dorothy's appearance on The Carson Show, Snider thought the timing was right. But Dorothy had changed her mind. The Lachaises flew to New York the day after she finished shooting to persuade her to reconsider. They were told by the production office that Dorothy could be found at Bogdanovich's suite at the Plaza. It was 3 or 4 in the afternoon, says Lachaise. There had been a cast party the night before. Dorothy answered the door in pajamas and said, "Oh my God, what are you doing here?" She shut the door, and when she came out again, she explained, "I can't invite you in. There are people here." Bogdanovich was inside, listening as Dorothy moved them into the corridor. They wanted permission from her to use a photo they had of her for a poster. They were working with Snider. She looked at the photos in the hallway, and we could tell by her eyes that she liked them. She took them inside. They came out and said, "Look how my chest is hanging down." Bogdanovich said Dorothy held out the proofs, and he looked over her shoulder. Again, creepy. He said the shots of her made her look cheap and ordinary, with none of her innocence. Lachaise said somebody in there was telling her what to do. She said, "Look, I'm confused. Have you shown these to Paul?" I said, "Dorothy, you're divorcing Paul." And she said, "I don't know, I just don't know." She turned them down. When Lachaise called the Plaza Suite the following week, a woman replied, "We don't know Dorothy Stratten. Stop harassing us." Paul felt axed in every other area, said Lachaise. This was his last bit of income. Dorothy and Bogdanovich planned to have a 4 to 6 week vacation together all over Europe once filming was finished. Her immigration status was up on August 1st, and she was officially working for Playboy. Bogdanovich wrote she was very beautiful and a skilled actress in the rushes. He worked with her for hours to prepare her for her role, as he did with Sybil, and she required few takes. Bogdanovich believed the crew was cynical of her reading on the set books he chose for her to expand her intellect, often classics like Great Expectations, Crime and Punishment, and A Farewell to Arms. She was also known to read diet books and maybe work that would be more appealing for someone her age. At barely 20, it's unlikely she would have chosen these kind of books for herself, although she reported to him one of her favorite books was The Idiot by Dostoevsky. Or maybe she knew he wanted to improve her, so she read what he wanted her to read. And once other people in entertainment heard Dorothy was in a real movie, then other doors began opening for her. She met with the editors of Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, who wanted a fashion layout of her timed to the release of the film. There were other agents calling for her TV and movie roles. Of course, she would have to finish with Playboy, but she would soon be 21 and free to explore her options. She was the first Playboy model to be considered for work outside the confines of men's entertainment. She thought of William Morris to represent her, and John Casablanca's agency Elite also expressed interest in Dorothy. Considering what we know now about many modeling agencies operating as criminal fronts for human trafficking, maybe that move would not have worked out so well for her. Elite signed Patty Hansen, and she was at the time the highest paid model in the world. She was also Bogdanovich's ex and acting in the same movie with his new girlfriend. Patty didn't care much for Dorothy. On her last day of shooting, she walked up to her and made a lewd comment about her big chest and walked away. It's hard to understand why Bogdanovich would throw his old girlfriend in with his new one, if not to cause some friction on the set. Other actresses like Colleen Camp became her friend once they spent time together. For Colleen's birthday in June, Dorothy wanted to throw her a party and bought her a silk blouse as a present. Playboy bunny Roseanne Caton told Colleen in private that she saw Dorothy's husband at the Playboy mansion and he seemed dangerous to her. Colleen asked Dorothy if she would be okay, and Dorothy said she didn't believe Snider would harm her. She was more worried about him harming himself. Dorothy had some health problems surface while they were filming, and she had to stay in the hospital overnight for a biopsy on two growths that appeared on either side of her face. Each one was at the jawline, just below her ear, and there was a noticeable swelling. The first fear was tumors and the chance of cancer. Bogdanovich worried about possible malignancy, but not for the reasons a man who claimed to love a woman would. Plastic surgery would take months, and what would happen to her role in the movie? He wrote, more important, what would happen to Dorothy? Disfigurement. Would it honestly, or would it not affect my love for her? There were two biopsy choices, needle or surgical knife. The knife would leave a larger scar, but the needle could spread a malignant tumor more quickly. Bogdanovich wrote he and Dorothy chose the needle. It wasn't his choice to make. Because of filming, Bogdanovich said he was unable to accompany Dorothy to her medical appointments. He referred to her again with his name for her Dr. He sent his assistant with her. That may have been when Dorothy called her mother and asked her to join her in New York, but her mother claimed her new husband would not allow it. Bogdanovich started thinking about what the remaining scenes would look like without having Dorothy there to finish. After a night of filming, he was awakened by her on the phone. After a night of filming, he was awakened by her on the phone, assuring him it was not malignant. He said he cried, and the doctor told Dorothy it was sarcoidosis or sarcoid granuloma, an extremely rare inflammation. Bogdanovich claimed Dorothy didn't call her mother until afterwards. Maybe. She did tell her that if something happened to her, everything she owned would go to her. Snider surprisingly called her and asked her why she was at the hospital. She asked him how he found out, and he said he had his ways. He sent his roommate, Dr. Kushner, to plead with Dorothy to return to Snider. Paul let everyone at the mansion and the Hollywood community know that Dorothy and Bogdanovich were living together in New York. She didn't want people to know about that. Neither Dorothy nor Bogdanovich had told Hefner, but he seemed to think they had both turned on the Playboy mogul. They were hardly keeping the relationship a secret, and Bogdanovich brought her around parts of New York where he was raised. Dorothy cried during the wrap party and hated to see it all end, but Peter said there was months of editing ahead after they had their European vacation together. Snider wanted to meet her as she flew into LA, but she explained she was going to London with some girlfriends, since Colleen would be there in the same city. He sent her some mementos from their relationship, along with a book titled What Men Need. She left the book behind as she packed. She left the book behind as she packed and asked out loud, "What about what women need?" Just before they finished shooting, Dorothy wrote her final poem. The bright green blades of grass are glistening with dew as the morning sun rises up over the hills and a breeze, ever so gently, flutters them about. And she stood to pluck a dandelion, and pauses, shuts her eyes tightly, blows hard, and the white fluff disperses all around as she makes a wish. She's thinking, but not sure of what. The day will be beautiful for a while. Instinct has been allowed to take its course and prove to be right somehow. And then she sits. Her dress encircles her, hides her feet, save the tips of her white socks and sandals. The stem of the dandelion has fallen. Somewhere, it doesn't matter. No reason for coming, really. Feels much better, though. Had I had much time to think. She sighs and places her hand on the grass to help her stand. She looks around and sighs again, and knows it will still be there. During their final weekend in New York, Dorothy presented Peter with a heavy gift wrapped present. Inside was a unicorn made of solid brass and nearly a foot high. She had it engraved to Peter, "One day since yesterday. Forever, Dorothy." They went to London and spent 10 nights together. The chauffeur who met them at the airport introduced himself as Paul, and they tried not to look at each other. It was a reminder of something they both wanted to forget. One night Dorothy was reading from a collection of F. Scott Fitzgerald stories, and she said she preferred his work to Hemingway's. On the last page of Winter Dreams, she read out loud. The dream was gone. Something had been taken from him. In a sort of panic, he pushed the palms of his hands into his eyes and tried to bring up a picture of the waters lapping on Sherry Island in the moonlit veranda, and Gingham on the golf links, and the dry sun, and the gold color of her neck's soft down, and her mouth damp to his kisses, and her eyes plaintive with melancholy, and her freshness like new fine linen in the morning. Why these things were no longer in the world. They had existed, and they existed no longer. For the first time in years the tears were streaming down his face. But they were for himself now. He did not care about mouth and eyes and moving hands. He wanted to care, and he could not care, for he had gone away, and he could never go back any more. The gates were closed, the sun was gone, and there was no beauty but the gray beauty of steel that withstands all time. Even the grief he could have borne was left behind in the country of illusion, of the richness of life, where his winter dreams had flourished. Peter started crying, and Dorothy smiled and put her arms around him. They went to plays together like Private Lives and Amadeus. One day while shopping, Dorothy excused herself to find some water and was delayed for a while. Peter went searching and couldn't find her. He acted like she had been kidnapped. He finally spotted her on a crowded street, and she shook her head at him when she realized how alarmed he was. "Poor baby," she said to him. He said he never wanted her out of his sight again. Peter was a lot. He was too much to deal with. Dorothy had her own issues to deal with. She didn't need some middle aged man stalking her. He was not picking up the signs that she was getting ready to fly on her own. Or maybe he did, and that was why he was acting so desperate. Dorothy confided to Peter that her mother was worried Paul might hurt her. Maybe he was vindictive enough to cut her face. She didn't agree. She didn't believe her husband would hurt her. Peter thought maybe Paul would come after him, but he was certain that Snider could be paid off. Apparently, she confided in Peter about a friend of hers who was maneuvered into sleeping with Hefner. Paul said when he expressed dismay, Dorothy was quick to defend her. She said there were a lot of pressures at Playboy. Peter would believe later that she was testing the waters to admit her own encounter with Hefner. But he only said the other women were not as smart as Dorothy was in avoiding the traps. She didn't mention the subject again. She began acting differently. She walked out of the first act of Dr. Faustus, a play about a man who sold his soul to the devil in exchange for fortune, fame, and power. There was a frenzied R word scene on stage, and the images in Peter's head of his young, beautiful virgin child being intimate with the evil men played in his head, and he projected his insecurities into the memories Dorothy had. He thought she blamed herself for what happened. She had sinned as much as the other women in the eyes of God. She told him she wasn't going to watch the play and was out the door before he could figure out what happened. He found her pacing in front of the theater. She headed the play. What kind of man would sell his soul to the devil? He told her it was a metaphor. Didn't a lot of people sell themselves for money or power? But not consciously to the devil, she responded. Dorothy told him he could stay and watch the play if he wanted to, but she didn't want to speak of it any further. In truth, Dorothy was still very young, and she was raised to believe in God and trust in what is good. The darker symbolism of the play was too much for her to comprehend, and she probably just didn't like it. She was angry at Peter for taking her to see it, and there was a growing resentment inside of her building toward him that he was not acknowledging. She packed the new clothes he bought for her into her suitcase and cried as he pushed her to talk to him. She didn't want to talk about it any more. Later, Peter twisted this scene in his mind to mean she was trying to protect their relationship from what he called her unpleasantness. Then Dorothy put on her deadpan mask and blocked him out completely. They went to an area near the Thames River called the Serpentine where they could be together. From time to time, Dorothy had a faraway look that Peter didn't understand, and when he asked her, she would just say nothing. She found a spot on the grass in the sun to sit, and they stared at each other. She started to laugh for no reason, and he joined her. They sat under the sun, laughing at nothing until they cried, and Peter wanted it to last forever. The Ninth Moon. Dorothy Stratten, Vancouver, 1976 to 77. Racing to catch up with time, but when out of breath, time still races on and laughs. Yet now there is no need trace, but time to rest, and let time's silly game be played by someone else. They returned to LA on July 30th, Peter's 41st birthday. He was nearly 21 years older than she was, old enough to be her father. At London's Heathrow Airport, Dorothy went to the bookstalls in the waiting area and found a copy of the Playboy Special Photo Edition. He said she held it out for him to see, but he had to move behind her to get a better look. She found a full color photo of herself sitting undressed on a rug. He said no matter where they were, the most intimate parts of her body were available to anyone who wanted to see. This wasn't art, it was corn. Dorothy said it was awful and returned the magazine to the rack. Snider was still in LA and increasingly in despair. He knew he could not have the power or resources to fight Bogdanovich. Maybe this thing is too big for me, he confided to a friend, and he talked about going back to Vancouver. But the prospect of returning in defeat was too humiliating. He felt Dorothy was now so completely sequestered by attorneys that he would never see her again. Late in July, his old machismo gave way to grief. He called a friend crying because he could not touch Dorothy or even get near her. About the same time, his roommate, Dr. Kushner, returned home one night to find him despondent in the living room. "This is really hard," Paul said, and broke down into tears. He wrote fragments of notes to Dorothy that were never sent, one written in red felt tip marker, and later found stuffed into one of his drawers was a rambling letter on how he couldn't get it together without her. With the lawyer's help, he drafted a letter to Bogdanovich telling him to quit influencing Dorothy and that Snider would forgive him. But the lawyer did not know if the letter was ever posted. Snider knew Dorothy was having an affair, but he could not prove it. So as the filming of They All Laughed drew to a close in mid-July, he did what many jealous and controlling husbands did. He hired a private eye, a 26-year-old freelance detective named Mark Goldstein. Goldstein later claimed to be a friend of both Dorothy and Paul, but in fact knew neither of them well. He was retained upon the recommendation of an unidentified third party. He would not say what exactly his mission was, but a Canadian lawyer who represented both Paul and Dorothy in Vancouver claimed Snider was seeking to document the affair with Bogdanovich in order to sue him for enticement to breach management contract, an agreement Snider believed inherent within their marriage contract. And it's the idea that marriage is a business contract that is most disturbing. Paul believed he was entitled to certain assets in the marriage, and by Peter breaking up his marriage, this robbed him of a lifestyle he would have enjoyed had the marriage continued. A plaintiff can seek monetary damages for loss of companionship, mental anguish, and loss of support, as if Dorothy never had the right to leave the marriage on her own. There is also a tort called alienation of affection. A few cases of this have been a few cases of this had been successful. A few cases of this has been successful on a conservative state level, but were usually overturned in higher courts. It's also referred to as a heart balm tort, and it requires proof of a happy marriage, wrongful or malicious conduct by the defendant, and a cause loss of affection. It treats spouses as property and blames the third party rather than the partner who broke the vows. That suit was to be filed in British Columbia, thought to be a suitable venue since both Snider and Stratten were Canadians and, it could be argued, had only gone to Los Angeles for business. Canada was more socially conservative compared to California in the 70s and 80s. The country had only adopted a federal divorce law in 1968 and was followed by the Divorce Act in 1986. Canadian marriages were seen as more permanent, with very little cohabitation outside of a more progressive Quebec. There are stronger There were stronger religious influences on institutional life, and there was a social stigma attached to divorce. Following the Divorce Act, adultery was a primary fault based ground for divorce in Canada. It allowed a spouse to divorce without waiting the standard 3-year separation period. It required strict proof of cheating, but couples were not allowed to conspire to stage adultery just to get a quickie divorce, although some couples did just that. By 1986, the proof of adultery was no longer needed, but Paul still needed proof in 1980. Goldstein began showing up regularly at Snider's apartment. Snider produced poems. Goldstein began showing up regularly at Snider's house. Goldstein began showing up regularly at Snider's house. Snider produced poems and love letters from Bogdanovich that he found among Dorothy's things. He instructed Goldstein to do an asset search on Dorothy and to determine whether or not Bogdanovich was plying her with the white lady, nose candy. Peter himself said they had tried the recreational substance a few times but didn't like it. You don't have to do something a few times to know you don't like it. More likely it was Dorothy who didn't like it, and Peter may have been a regular user of it, just as he pointed his guilty finger at Paul and claimed he used it. Peter wrote about the effects this substance has on someone with a little too much authority and with remnants of enjoyment. It was a common substance in the Hollywood community, but it wasn't for Dorothy. She didn't even like Peter lighting up with the wacky tobacco. She didn't even like Peter lighting up with the wacky tobacco around her because Paul smoked it often and it reminded her of him. Customs stopped Dorothy in New York and noticed her visa was soon to expire. She called the Playboy immigration lawyers but didn't have enough change on her to complete the call, so she charged it to the phone she and Paul shared. Snider knew then she was back in America. The phone company called Snider for his approval, and that alerted his detective, Mark Goldstein, so he could stake out the Bogdanovich house. She had returned in time to attend Hefner's annual Midsummer's Night Dream Party on August 1st, but both she and Peter agreed not to attend that year. She knew she had to tell Paul about her relationship, but she didn't want to tell Hefner. Peter said he would do that. She still had work for Playboy, and that required traveling. When she saw Peter's children at the airport, she was quieter and more apprehensive than she had been with them earlier. Paul called, but was told by the people at the Playboy mansion he could not visit there unless he was with Dorothy. They were sorry, but they knew there were problems in their marriage. Paul staked out Peter's home with a .38 weapon in his pocket he borrowed from a friend. When neither Dorothy nor Peter was there, he later told a girlfriend he felt like ending his own life. Dorothy's visa was extended for another 6 months. The new lovers were pulled in opposite directions all day, and in the evening she brought him upstairs where she unpacked all the clothes he bought for her. It was the same bedroom Sybil once occupied. They made love and slept for the night. The next day they saw an ad. In the trade papers. Her billing read, "Introducing Dorothy R. Stratten, Playboy Playmate of the Year as Galaxina." Although the movie had no connection to Playboy, they were still attaching the brand to her name. Dorothy and Peter did not attend the 1980 Midnight Summers. Dorothy and Peter did not attend the 1980 Midnight Summer Dream Party, but Paul's detective did. He had met Hefner before and would not be there unless he was allowed. The next morning, she went to Patrick Curtis's apartment to pick up her things and give him back his key. He had a crush on her, but Dorothy kept him in the friend apartment. Then she returned to Peter and his children. It seemed she was more likely to attach to Peter if she became close to his children, so he encouraged a relationship between them. He was not happy she would leave the next day to work in Houston and Dallas for 4 days of promotional work, but as she pointed out, she had a job and obligations to fulfill. There she appeared radiant, apparently reveling in her own success. She had been approaching she had been approached about playing Marilyn Monroe in in Larry Larry Schiller's made-for-TV movie, but she had been too busy with the Bogdanovich film. She had been discussed as a candidate for Charlie's Angels, although Wilder thought she could do better. She was scheduled to meet with independent producer Martin Croft, who was considering her for his new film, The Last Desperado. It all seemed wonderful to her. Dorothy already had an apartment in Beverly Hills with Peter's assistant, although he felt she was really going to live with him. Dorothy already had an apartment in Beverly Hills with Peter. Dorothy already had an apartment in Beverly Hills with Peter's assistant, although he felt she was really going to live with him. It would be the address listed on her death certificate. He reasoned she needed a separate mailing address and some place to be alone. Again, Sybil had done the same thing. Someone for Snider called Peter's house wanting to know about the poster, and he declined the business deal for Dorothy. Dorothy called Paul from Houston and set up a lunch date with him on Friday, August 8th at about 2 p.m. for lunch. Dorothy called Paul from Houston and set up a lunch date with him on Friday, August 8th at about 2 p.m. after she flew home. He said he loved her, and she returned the love. He still had hope she was returning to him. Dorothy was not so cynical that she could enjoy her good fortune without pangs of regret. She cried in private. Until the end, she retained a lingering tenderness for Paul Snider and felt bound to see him taken care of after the divorce. After hearing from her, Carpenter wrote Snider was as giddy as a con whose sentence had been commuted, for he believed somehow that evening would be all right between them again. The night before their appointed meeting, he went out for sandwiches with friends. He went out for sandwiches with friends, and he was confident, and he was his blustering, confident old self. It would be different, he said. He would let her know that he had changed. I've really got to vacuum the rug, he crowed. The Queen is coming back. Peter called the Playboy mansion to speak to Hefner, and he told his secretary to tell Peter he was in a meeting. He did not return the call. Under Peter's influence, Dorothy had altered her look slightly from the Playboy centerfold they turned her Under Peter's influence, Dorothy had altered her look slightly from the Playboy centerfold they turned her into. She also wasn't as willing to do the Playboy work she once was so willing to do. At a banquet in Dallas, one of the Playboy distributors grabbed at her chest and wanted his pal to take a photo. She felt humiliated and violated. Hefner finally called Peter back after he called him for 3 days in a row. He asked to talk to him in person, and Hefner said he could stop by any time, but his tone was icy. Peter said Dorothy was great in the film, and Hefner said he heard they were together. Yes, Peter said, they were in love. He paused briefly and chuckled. Peter had a weakness for blondes. Peter laughed too loudly and assured Hefner that he planned on settling down with Dorothy. Hefner assured Peter that Snider would not be allowed in the mansion without Dorothy, and there were already rumors around Hollywood about them being together. Back in the old Hollywood days, there were houses of ill repute where the women who worked there dressed up as the famous movie actress where the women who worked there dressed up as the famous movie actresses, and for a price the men could come in and be with the girl of their dreams. That's what Peter thought of when he saw the test slides of Dorothy dressed up as the screen goddesses. Playboy Playboy was getting ready to have Dorothy on the Merv Griffin show, and she was offered $100,000 for the role in a western. She was going to travel a lot, and Peter knew he would be separated from her for long stretches. He wasn't happy about it. He was not supportive of her career. When Dorothy met with Paul at the home they once shared, he was wearing a suit and offered her flowers and champagne. She told him she wanted to go to a restaurant. The lunch date was a disaster. The two of them ended up back in the apartment, squared off sullenly on the couch. Dorothy confessed at last she was in love with Bogdanovich and wanted to proceed with some kind of financial settlement. Before leaving, she went through her closet and took the clothes she wanted. The rest, she said, he could give to Patty. Snider had found out some things about Peter to warn Dorothy about. She thought he was going to make her a big star, then she better think again. He destroyed Sybil's career. Is that how she wanted to end up? There was more. Bogdanovich paid a woman named Lee $5,000 to have sex with him and another man. It happened at the mansion. Maybe that was the kind of stuff she liked. She grew angry and they argued until Dr. Kushner walked in on them. She managed to cheer him up, and when Patty Lorman arrived, the two seemed friendly. Was she staying? The 17-year-old Patty asked. No, Dorothy said, and she told her about the clothes she was leaving for her. Peter had his assistant call the house, and Dorothy said she would return to the apartment soon. She told Paul she would see him on Sunday again. That alone was enough to give Paul false hopes about the relationship. Carpenter wrote, those who saw him during the 5 days prior to the unaliving caught only glimpses of odd behavior. In retrospect, they appeared to form a pattern of intent. Dorothy returned to see Peter and told him Paul seemed sad but made no mention of the accusations. Peter rambled on for a long paragraph in his book about how Snider learned of the seedy accusations from Lee's former husband, and he wanted revenge on Peter. He said another man lured him into a compromising position with Lee in the man's jacuzzi. 6 months later, Peter claimed he was just helping Lee, who he said had a haunted childhood compounded by humiliating experiences in the men's magazine business. She stayed at his house for a few days. He gave her a cashmere sweater and $5,000 to rent an apartment and have her car fixed. That's all that happened, he swore. Maybe. Paul found out he could not buy a gun in the gun shop because he wasn't a U.S. citizen and his visa had expired. Carpenter wrote he was preoccupied with weapons. Much earlier in the year, Snider had borrowed a weapon from a friend named Chip, the consort of one of Dorothy's playmates. Paul never felt easy, he said, without a weapon, a holdover from his days on the East End. But Paul had to give the revolver back that Friday afternoon because Chip was leaving town. He looked around for another weapon. Then he invited everyone, including his main girlfriend Lynn and Goldstein, to a barbecue at his place on Sunday. During the afternoon, he pulled Goldstein aside and asked the detective to buy a machine gun for him. He needed it, he said, for home protection. Goldstein talked him out of it. Goldstein had a weekly newspaper he carried with him called The Recycler that featured personal ads of all sorts. He knew Snider wanted another weapon for protection, so he held on to the paper for him. In the classifieds, Snider found someone in the San Fernando Valley who wanted to sell a 12-gauge Mossberg Pump Weapon. He circled the ad and called the owner. On Monday, he drove into the valley to pick up the gun but got lost in the dark. The owner obligingly brought it to a construction site where he showed Snider how to load and fire it. Dorothy picked up Louise from the airport and told her they would not be staying with Paul. She explained she had her own apartment, but until then they would stay at Peter's house. Peter described Louise as a sweet, shy girl with a wild sense of humor when her introspective nature let it out. She had a critical, watchful eye and looked out for her big sister's welfare. When they arrived at the house, Dorothy told Louise not to tell their mother where they were staying and not to mention Peter's place at all. Nellie asked about Paul and told Dorothy she should get out of town for 6 to 8 months. She said she would have her husband report Paul to immigration. Peter imagined Dorothy was happy, thinking about their future together, being married, and having children. That was probably not the case. She was still dealing with a husband who was making her miserable, and she was trying to get rid of him in the nicest way possible. Dorothy, meanwhile, had promised to call Paul on Sunday, but did not ring until Monday, a slight that annoyed him. They agreed to meet on Thursday at 11:30 a.m. to discuss the financial settlement. She had been instructed by her advisors to offer him a specified sum. During previous conversations, Paul thought he had heard Dorothy say, "I'll always take care of you," but he could not remember the exact words. Louise heard her crying when she was talking to him on the phone. Goldstein thought it might be a good idea to wire Snyder's body for sound so they could get a taped account if Dorothy repeated her promise to provide for him. They could not come up with the proper equipment, however, and abandoned the plan. Peter went to talk to Hefner, and he believed Hefner was acting cold to him. He said Hefner had a boyish charm, but he looked more sinister, and he felt like the enemy. He decided it was because he was with Dorothy and Hefner had wanted her. He had remodeled the mansion, which was a rarity for him. Other people over the years had commented on how run down it looked. He gave Peter a tour of the remodeling. Hefner was still hospitable, and he said he and Dorothy could visit any time they liked, whether they were together or separate. He may have had doubts their relationship would last. Peter twisted the meeting in his head and thought Hefner believed Dorothy betrayed him, but it was really Hefner knew Peter had betrayed him. He was encouraging Dorothy to turn against Playboy in a way she never had before. After modeling all day, Dorothy looked through her fan mail and tore up the letters after she read them. Louise was with her and noticed she seemed bothered, and it frightened the young girl. On Wednesday, the day he picked up the weapon, Snider seemed in an excellent mood. He told his roommate that Dorothy would be coming over and that she had agreed to look at a new house that he thought might be a good investment for her. He left the impression that they were on amiable terms. That evening, he dropped by Bill Lachazy's studio to look at promotional shots of Patty. There, too, he was relaxed and seemed happy. In an offhanded way, he told Lachazy that he had bought a weapon for protection. He also talked of strange and unrelated things that did not seem menacing in the context of his good spirits. He talked of Claudia Jennings, who had lost her life with a movie in progress. Some playmates get unalived, he observed, and when that happened, it caused a lot of chaos. Dorothy was distant from Peter, and it seemed every movement she made he had to know about and read something into. She seemed annoyed by him and registered his words when he said he spoke to Hefner, but she didn't say anything. He told her about the invite to the mansion, and she only said she didn't want to go, as he said the same thing. She was acting as cold to him as Hefner had been, but Peter only became more solicitous toward her. After the three girls went to bed, Dorothy laid on the bed fully clothed and listened to the new picture Peter was preparing. The storyline was about an orchestra conductor and a Dutch girl who ended up getting married, and it was clearly about Peter and Dorothy. As it became clearer where the story was heading, her expression darkened and her eyes grew sad. She started to cry and wailed no. Peter wasn't expecting her negative response. Didn't she like the story? She nodded and he continued, so Dorothy smiled. But was she really smiling, or was she wearing a mask? She told him she wanted to take a shower, and he said she asked if he wanted to join her. Of course he did, and she knew that already. Peter could sense she was not really interested in being with him, but later they made love. When he woke early in the morning, Dorothy was already up, and he wanted her to return to bed, but she wanted to swim and get moving for the day. Peter just brushed it off as being busy. Before she left, she told him her period was late by 2 weeks. She said they would worry about it in a couple more weeks. He said he wished he told her he wanted to marry her and have children, but was that what she wanted? Dorothy brought Louise with her to talk to Marilyn Grabowski, and the girl accidentally mentioned the house they were staying in. Dorothy intervened and said something about her new apartment. When Marilyn left the room, Dorothy reminded her sister about not telling anyone where they were staying. Paul had spent the same day with his lawyer, Mike Kelly. He drew up a legal letter from Snider to Stratten, as well as a management agreement for her to sign. Kelly was married to a former playmate, but for most playmates, their lives don't end up with a marriage to a wealthy man. Many turn to harder adult entertainment or usually go back to where they came from with a tarnished image. Dorothy also went to a lawyer Peter had recommended. She wanted a clearer picture of how much she had and how much would Paul get in the divorce. She was willing to give him half of her earnings from They All Laughed, and it wasn't that much. Playboy employees were desperately trying to get hold of Dorothy, and they left letters titled urgent on the door of her apartment. She did not go to the apartment, and her roommate spent the night at her boyfriend's place, so neither one knew the letters were there. Peter noticed Dorothy had been nervous that evening and assumed later she was worried about Paul, but if she was really concerned he would hurt her, then she wouldn't have met with him. She was concerned about people knowing she was with Peter, but she agreed to go out to eat with him and the three girls. That last night Dorothy was alive, Peter remembered it was the fourth night of the ninth moon of the year. Dorothy asked Peter if he wanted to take a jacuzzi with her in his bathtub. He had candles set up, and Dorothy told him, "Oh, you've done this before, have you?" There was a slight edge in her voice. He knew she didn't want to get into the jacuzzi and was only doing it for him. Maybe he was the one who asked her. And although he knew she really didn't want to, he had her do it anyways. She wasn't comfortable, and her eyes were oddly dark. Peter asked if she was okay, and she nodded. He said she suggested they make love on the carpets beside the tub just to get it over with, and of course Peter agreed. He noticed she had a sad desperation in her eyes, so he said they should just go to bed. Dorothy agreed. Peter made love to her in bed, and he could tell she was not enjoying it. He stopped and rolled over to the side. After a few minutes, she moved on top of him and finished what they started. Dorothy was on the phone the next morning of August 14th, and she didn't want Peter to know she was placing a call. She wanted privacy and thought the kitchen was the best place. Peter complained again when Dorothy was up early to swim and start her day. He wanted her to lay in bed with him for a while. Obviously, she didn't want to. He wanted time to talk to her, and she had excuses not to give him that time for weeks. Dorothy told Peter that she was going to see her attorney and then go to a photo shoot at the mansion afterwards. In reality, Dorothy had agreed to meet Paul at the house they once shared together to make a final break with him. She had $1,000 in an envelope that she hoped would buy her peace and separation from her tormentor. Dorothy confided to Louise that she would meet Paul that day, but she told her sister not to tell anyone, especially Peter. She told her she would be back before 2:30. "Do you promise?" Louise asked. Dorothy promised. Peter said he made himself cottage cheese and yogurt, and after speaking with Dorothy for a moment, she coolly told him not to speak with his mouth full. It wasn't very attractive. He said the force with which she spoke and the darkness in her eyes shocked him. He wanted to hug her and tell her everything would be all right between them. Dorothy's expression did not change. Her teeth seemed to be clenched. Her attitude toward him was severe. Peter said it aged her, made her look older than her 20 years. So she didn't look like the innocent little girl that turned Peter on and the men at Playboy anymore. Good. She was changing, growing up. She herself said she learned in the last 1.5 years what 5 years of regular living would have brought her. She wanted to take control of her own life and make her own decisions. She could be without a man for a while. Even a beautiful woman in the adult entertainment business could be on her own. She felt pawed at. Men had been constantly hitting on her and wanted to be with her. That was enough to turn her off men for at least a while. Peter really wasn't getting the message. The last thing she needed or wanted was to tie her life to some middle director twice her age who expected her to star in his movies for very little money. She had to have known the movie she made with Peter was not going to make her career. She did love him when they were filming together, or she thought she did. But many actors and directors end up hooking up when they work together. It's like they are thrown together during these unreal situations, but they break up when they return home and have to face reality. She wanted to move on. She wanted to move on to new projects coming her way that had nothing to do with Bogdanovich. She wanted to divorce her husband and experience freedom in her life, maybe for the first time. She wanted to finish her contract with Playboy and place that work in her past. And she wanted to look forward to a future she decided for herself. Nellie said she had a premonition about her daughter. She had trouble reaching them in LA, but Louise called and she wanted the phone number where they were at. The girl lied to her mother and said it wasn't written on the wall. She didn't know it. Dorothy was at her lawyer's office when Paul called and wanted to know if she was there. Did she know about the house? What house? Her lawyer asked. Paul sounded friendly on the phone, maybe too friendly. Dorothy said he was all right. They had come to an understanding. All he wanted was money and a green card. She didn't have to meet Paul. Her lawyer could take care of it. But Dorothy said she would handle it. Peter wrote that Dorothy knew Paul was a threat to her life. But Dorothy didn't know. If she did, then she wouldn't have met him. She couldn't conceive that the man she married, the man she knew for years, who helped her get into Playboy, who knew her family, who shared her same background, who once shared the same bed, the man she said vows to, would ever hurt her. He had been emotionally and psychologically manipulative and abusive at times, but those were things she was willing to shake off, although she shouldn't have. He had never really been physically violent with her. She thought she knew him. She thought she was safe. She was not. Dorothy thought she was the expert at wearing a mask to hide her feelings. She had no idea the man she married was able to hide from her how dangerous he really was. Dorothy stopped by the bank and cashed a check for $1,000. She knew he was usually broke and assumed he would accept the gesture. She promised to meet Paul at 11:30 but was running late. Peter told Patty and Lynn Paul told Patty and Lynn that he should be finished by 2:30 and they went shopping together. Goldstein had followed her to Paul's house and he had been following her all along. Once she went to the house, he drove off and called at 12:30 to talk to a breathless Paul who said everything was going well in code. At 2 p.m. he called again, but no one picked up the phone. Both cars were still parked outside the house, so he decided to call later. Carpenter reported no one entered the house until 5 when Patty and another of Paul's little girlfriends returned home, noticed Dorothy's car, and they saw the door to Snider's room closed. Since they heard no sounds, they assumed he wanted privacy. The two girls left to go skating and returned at 7 p.m. By then, the doctor had arrived home and noticed the door was closed. He also heard the unanswered ringing on Snider's downstairs phone. Shortly before midnight, Goldstein called Patty and asked her to knock on Paul's door. She really didn't want to, so he asked to speak to the doctor. The latter agreed to check, but even as he walked downstairs, he felt some foreboding. The endless ringing had put him on edge, and his German shepherd had been pacing and whining in the yard behind Paul's bedroom. The doctor knocked, and when there was no response, he pushed the door open. The scene burnt his senses, and he yanked the door shut. During her last visit to Vancouver, Dorothy wrote a poem called The Day of the Last World. A tornado of thought sweeping the mind, wanting to close your eyes and open them again to a new beginning, or to start on the right road. Life is a mysterious path which no two travel alike, and once the chosen path is taken, there is no turning back. On Thursday, August 14th, 1980, between noon and 1 p.m., in the bedroom of a West Los Angeles house, Dorothy was unalived by Paul Snider, and then he self-exited. They were both nude. Dorothy lay crouched across the bottom corner of a low bed. Both knees were on the carpet, and her right shoulder was drooping. Her blonde hair hung naturally, oddly unaffected by the violence to her countenance. The shell had entered above her left eye, leaving the bones of her beautiful face shattered and displaced in a welter of pulp. Her body, mocking the soft, languid poses of her pictorials, was in full rigor. Near her head was Paul's handmade bondage rack set for rear entry. Before taking her life, he put her in the bondage machine he made and R-worded her. Loops of tape, used and unused, were lying about, and strands of long blonde hair were discovered clutched in Snider's right hand. After freeing her, he fired a weapon point blank at the left side of her face. The tip of her left forefinger was shot off in the explosion when she raised her hand to her face. He dragged her body across the room and violated her again. Paul left a self-unaliving note before exiting himself. He was found face down, lying parallel to the foot of the bed. The muzzle of the Mossberg burnt his right cheek as the shell tore upward through his brain. The blast, instead of driving him backwards, whipped him forward over the length of the gun. He had always said he would rather not live than go to jail. Dorothy had apparently spent some time upstairs because her purse was found lying in the middle of the living room floor. In it was a note in Paul's handwriting explaining his financial distress. He had no green card, it said, and he required support. Dorothy's offer, however, fell short of support. It was a flat settlement of only $7,500, which she claimed represented half of her total assets after taxes. Not enough, said one friend, to put a nice little sports car in his garage. She had bought the first installment to mollify Paul's inevitable disappointment. Police found $1,100 in cash among her belongings, another $400 among his. There was no amount of money that would have satisfied Paul. It never was about money. Fights over money are never about money. It's about control, and Paul could not handle losing control of Dorothy. He could not let her go. It had been exactly 2 years and 1 day since Dorothy left Canada for LA when her life ended. Kushner called Goldstein, and he arrived, but no one had called the police. They were then called, and Goldstein called the Playboy Mansion to tell Hefner. Dorothy and Snider were gone. Hefner, thinking the call a prank, would not come to the phone at first. When he did, he asked for the badge number of the officer at the scene. It was an unaliving self-exit, Hefner replied, as if he had suspected Paul had been capable of doing it all along. Dorothy had a session with the Playboy photographer, and she was running late. She had never done that before. They assumed she had just gone Hollywood and was late like many entitled models and actresses, but that wasn't Dorothy. When asked by an interviewer a few months before her death whether or not she was worried that her life would end as tragically as Monroe's due to the nature of her business, Dorothy shrugged and said, "I just try to take life one day at a time." Tower Struck by Lightning was written by Dorothy in Vancouver, 1977. As you lie sleeping, so innocent and content, the world around you doesn't stop, but keeps turning, and time doesn't wait, and has no mercy. As you lie sleeping, another, at the same moment, is crying, and still another is laughing. Time has no pattern. Some are worried and try to save time for a later date, but then realize time cannot be saved, and all the while they are living, they are also dying. Louise finally told Peter that Dorothy went to see Paul. He kept close tabs on his new love and was worried as the evening set in, so Louise let the truth slip at about 6 that evening. Peter was very worried, and as soon as he heard where she was, a chill ran through him. He first thought he had lost her to her husband, but recalled that Dorothy was adamant she was leaving Paul. He waited anxiously for the phone to ring, and his daughter picked on him and told him it's not like Dorothy's unalived. Peter had Linda call Paul's house, but there was no answer. At 7 p.m., a friend offered to drive by Paul's house, but Peter didn't want to make it more difficult for Dorothy. Louise was angry Dorothy hadn't kept her promise. The girls went to bed, and Peter stayed up until the phone rang at 11:30 p.m. Finally, he thought, Peter was smiling. Hefner was the one who called Bogdonovich. Peter picked up the phone to hear Hefner's voice. He asked how was he doing. Hefner was silent. Then he asked, "Have you heard?" "No," he answered. "Heard what?" "Oh, God," Hefner began. Then after a short pause he said, "Dorothy was gone." There was no conversation, Hefner said. I was afraid that he had gone into shock or something. When he didn't respond, I called the house under another number. A male friend was there to make sure he was all right. He was overcome. When Peter found out, he blacked out and fell to the floor on his knees near the closet, scratching and crawling like a wounded animal. He mumbled, "She's dead," then screamed it. Peter curled into a ball and had to be sedated. Much later, he told his daughters, and they were just devastated. The following morning at 9 a.m., Nellie was told by a Canadian Mountie. They knew about Dorothy's death in the early hours, but wanted to wait to tell her family after they had breakfast. When she saw him, she thought maybe something had happened to her son. He told her what happened, and she invited him into her home, where he dried her morning dishes for her. She heard the words, but she couldn't believe it. Her daughter was gone. Nellie's husband said Louise should be sent back to Vancouver to be with her own family when she was told the horrible news about her sister. Everyone had to be strong, to put on a mask, as Dorothy did, to keep the truth from her. She was told Dorothy had to go to New York, and an employee from Playboy flew back with her to Canada. The story was already in the newspaper, and they had to hide everything to keep it from her. Dorothy's brother was told about her unaliving when he returned home, and he cried. Louise, oblivious to the truth, walked into the house and handed him a couple of cards he had asked Dorothy to buy him, and he threw them into the fire. Nellie told her then, but Louise didn't believe it. Dorothy was in New York, but her mother told her she was in heaven. Louise shook her head and said, "Oh no, Mommy." Peter later returned to places in New York and Vancouver where he and Dorothy had once been, and he thought of the play Our Town and the 18-year-old character Emily, who died in childbirth but wanted to relive a single day, her 12th birthday. She was warned that knowing the future as she lived the past was too painful. She wanted to do it anyways, and found the warning was true. Every small detail broke her heart as she realized how precious time was. And Peter understood that pain. When people are in mourning, they often believe the ones they are missing have a way of contacting them from heaven. Every light that flickers, or any little similarity they shared, is a sign that they are being watched from above. Maybe they're right. Peter believed for a long time Dorothy was still with him. He returned to read the card book he told her about when they were first meeting at his home, and he realized he had made a mistake. He said he studied the formulas again and realized the card that represented him and the card that represented Dorothy remained aligned for the rest of his life. Wherever he went, he did nothing but remember Dorothy. The way she looked in the morning light, the way she looked so natural after a nap, and the way she smiled. He went into Nicola's, a New York Italian restaurant, and when he went to the men's room, he found naked photos of Dorothy pinned to the wall with other women from men's magazines. He told Nicola he should take the photos down. The Spelling of God by Dorothy Stratten, written in Vancouver, 1978. The picture I see are not blue or green or brown, but a shade of which the color had not been invented, in a shape which cannot be imagined. How can people be satisfied by accepting someone without exploring them? Is the connection only physical? A year and a half after Dorothy's death, Louise had a dream. The time was the present. Louise was in a field of grass, and Dorothy was with her, looking like she had in life. There were people they knew around them, but they couldn't see Dorothy. They were all heading to exhibit booths, and Louise wanted to see what the attraction was. Dorothy took her by the hand, and they walked to one exhibit where they found a photo of Dorothy unclothed. The other booths had women undressed, but Dorothy's booth was the most popular. The sisters cried together, and Louise asked how they could do that. She said she missed her sister so much, and Dorothy said she did too. Then she took Louise's hand again, and they walked away. It's not a surprise she would have a dream like that, since the exploitation of Dorothy did not end with her death. The dead do not have rights. The private detective Mark L. Goldstein hired by Paul, attempted to peddle what he knew or had obtained from his former client. He had personal papers and letters and poems by Dorothy that were legally owned by her estate. Teresa Carpenter, the village voice, sent Peter a list of questions he ignored. He hired a private detective himself to investigate Dorothy's unaliving. Playboy interviewed Nellie, and by cooperating with them, it seemed she was endorsing Playboy. She was not. She had never even seen a single page of that magazine. Playboy also wanted to interview Peter, but he refused when he found out the tasteful photos they promised to use would include just her bare chest. Peter bought the rights to use her work for a book he wanted to complete, and Nellie was given a weekly stipend as a consultant for the book. Dorothy had asked Peter to write a sad love story for her where there was a death at the end. He would go on to honor her wish. MGM TV paid Goldstein $65,000 for TV movie rights to the life of Dorothy Stratten. Playboy objected to the movie at first, but when the team at Playboy were depicted sympathetically in the film, they had Hefner's approval. A popular Canadian group named Prime wrote an emotional song about her. Galaxina opened with Dorothy's body in all the ads. The reviews were poor, but kind to Dorothy. Death of a Playmate by Teresa Carpenter was published in November 1980 and was syndicated to newspapers all over the world. Carpenter won a Pulitzer Prize for journalism. She believed Hefner treated Dorothy well, but his policies and philosophy had been directly responsible for her death. Carpenter also quoted a press statement Peter made. Dorothy Stratten was a gifted and intelligent actress, as she was beautiful, and she was very beautiful indeed in every way imaginable, most particularly her heart. She and I fell in love during her picture and had planned to be married as soon as her divorce was final. The loss to her mother and father, her brother and sister, to my children, to her friends, and to me is larger than we can calculate. But there is no life Dorothy's touch that had not been changed for the better through knowing her, however briefly. Dorothy looked at the world with love, and she believed all people are good deep down. She was mistaken, but it is among the most generous and noble errors we can make. Carpenter believed that Dorothy did not have plans to marry Peter, and she was probably right. Hefner called Peter and told him that the article said that in a kind way and asked again for an interview, but he refused. Bob Fosse bought the movie rights to the Village Voice article for $130,000 and wrote the screenplay himself. He titled it after Snider's license plate, Star 80. Hefner asked if he would be dancing in the film. A Playboy article appeared in May 1981, and Nellie threatened to sue for using work from Dorothy she then owned. They offered her a one-time payment of $15,000, and Nellie agreed. They quoted Dorothy as praising the Playboy way of life. In November 1981, Death of a Playmate, the Dorothy Stratten story, aired on NBC with Jamie Lynn Curtis as Dorothy. The reviews were negative and the ratings were unremarkable. In the credits were technical advisor Mark Goldstein. By the end of 1981, They All Laughed was released to mixed notices, Peter said. They still had to edit They All Laughed, and after spending months in the dark, alone with images of dead Dorothy flickering on the screen, he kind of lost it. Throughout the film, Dorothy looked stunningly beautiful, ethereal even. It was one of those scenes that can make a career, recalled a member of the crew. Maybe. People in the screening room rustled when they saw her. She didn't have many lines, she just looked so good. Dorothy's glimmering ghost is forever captured in the movie, bathed in white light and roller skating through a maze of infidelities. Peter said he paid $2.8 million to buy the picture back from Time Life and 20th Century Fox, and he tried to distribute it on his own company. Other sources said in 1981, Fox, the studio set to distribute They All Laughed, shelved the movie due to poor test screenings. Unable to let Dorothy languish, Peter bought it himself and distributed it himself. He paid $5 million, made less than $1 million. It forced Peter into bankruptcy. The first memorial tribute to Dorothy by Playboy ran no undressed photos of her, but explicit images would follow, including video cassette and cable TV tributes featuring never before footage of Dorothy. The December issue featured Stratton as one of the sex stars of 1980. At the end of 12 pages of the biggest stars in show business, Bo Derek, Brooke Shields, etc., she appeared topless, one chest draped with a gossamer scarf. A caption lamented her death, which cut short what seasoned star watchers predicted was sure to be an outstanding film career. Dorothy's undressed image continued to be displayed by Playboy on a regular basis. The 80s began with Stratton and ended with Hefner's second wife, Kimberly Conrad, for 1989. In the end, Dorothy Stratten was less memorable for herself than for the yearning she evoked, Carpenter concluded. In Snider, a lust for the score; in Hefner, a longing for a star; in Bogdanovich, a desire for the eternal ingenue. Dorothy became more popular in death than she may have achieved when she was alive. Just like Marilyn Monroe, Hollywood sure is rough on women, particularly beautiful blonde movie stars. In the spring of 1984, Dorothy's estate still was not settled, with Snider's father wanting a 50-50 split, but he settled for the Star 80 Mercedes and $5,000 in cash. Nellie asked for Snider's mother to receive half. She said she was the only member of Paul's family who deserved anything. Dorothy's estate was not worth much. Paul's family received $20,000 just to get him out of Dorothy's estate and keep the family from using her name, while Dorothy's family received about $5,000. Of course, Peter was supporting the family. Fosse wrote a letter to Nellie offering her $25,000 to prove his good intentions, but Nellie did not give him permission to use her name or any of Dorothy's family members' names. Peter's name was also changed. Eventually, a financial settlement was made. Peter said the movie did not depict Paul using recreational substances, but had a scene where Paul was complaining that Peter was giving Dorothy, the white lady nose candy. That was true, even if he didn't like it. He said the movie was mediocre and it received mixed reviews. Mariel Hemingway played Dorothy in the Fosse picture, and that seemed almost appropriate considering her grandfather's words are on Dorothy's grave. She altered her appearance greatly for the role, including a chest augmentation, but Peter did not think she looked enough like Dorothy. No one could ever be like Dorothy, but perhaps there was someone who resembled her enough in his eyes. Nellie would permanently separate from her husband when both she and the barely teenage Louise made their home in LA to live with Peter. Peter claimed Dorothy's mother, Nellie, allowed her husband to decide what to do with Dorothy's body, and he had her cremated and her ashes scattered in an oak casket just a few yards from Marilyn Monroe. Hefner was eventually entombed right beside Marilyn, a man she never met, and a PIMP who made money off of her body. Very creepy. Paul's body was returned to Canada for burial. He was buried at Skara Tesdek Cemetery in New Westminster, Metro Vancouver Regional District, British Columbia. It's a Jewish cemetery serving the Vancouver Jewish community since 1929 and is considered consecrated ground following Jewish burial customs. His grave has an inscription in love and memory of a beloved son and brother. Nellie initially wanted Dorothy to be buried in Canada so she could be close to the people she loved, but she acquiesced to Peter's request for her to remain in LA, in West Memorial Park Cemetery, not far from his home and where Marilyn Monroe was entombed. Dorothy had wanted Nellie to fly to New York to talk about her problems, but Nellie had just met the man she would marry, and he didn't want her to leave. Peter said Nellie never forgave him for that or herself for not going. Between that and the money she received, she must have felt an obligation to allow Peter to make certain decisions about Dorothy that a man she barely knew for 10 months should not normally be allowed to make. There was a quote on Dorothy's grave from one of Hemingway's novels, no doubt chosen by Peter. They should have chosen one of Dorothy's poems. The inscription only dramatized her unaliving rather than celebrating her life. If people bring so much courage to this world, the world has to unalive them to break them. So, of course, it unalives them. It unalives the very good and the very gentle and the very brave impartially. If you are none of these, you can be sure it will unalive you too, but there will be no special hurry. Hefner was at her funeral. Her father, Simon Hoogstraten, was at the funeral for the daughter he hadn't seen since she was 4, nor did he contribute to her welfare. He did not respond to her when she invited him to her high school graduation. His eyes looked haunted, his face frozen in shock. Maybe if he was around, he could have warned her about Paul. After the service, everyone went to Peter's home for rest and refreshments. Peter said he could not forgive Hefner, or Paul, or himself. Peter blamed the Hefner Playboy Smex factory for her death even more than Paul. The book, written by Peter Bogdonovich about Dorothy, was published in 1984, The Killing of the Unicorn, Dorothy Stratten, 1960-1980, with scathing referrals to Hefner and Playboy. He blamed Hefner for what happened to Dorothy, claimed Hefner had a hatred of women, and attacked the empire he built off the nude bodies of women. In interviews, Bogdanovich said Hefner wasn't the main villain because obviously that was Snider who took her life, but Hefner was definitely culpable. The irony that Hefner does not perceive, or at least failed to acknowledge, was that Stratten was destroyed not by random particulars, but by a germ breeding within the ethic. One of the tacit tenets of Playboy philosophy, that women can be possessed, have found a fervent adherent in Paul Snider. He had bought the dream without qualification, and he thought of himself as perhaps one of Playboy's most honest apostles. He acted out of dark fantasies never intended to be realized. Instead of fondling himself in private, instead of wreaking abstract violence upon a centerfold, he ravaged a playmate in the flesh. Hefner was more than just culpable in Peter's book. He was the ultimate flesh merchant. If the shadowy Hefner side of the pyramid had not existed, Dorothy would not have died. She could have dealt with Paul Snider, a small-town pimp who first spotted and sold her, but she could not handle the slick, professional machinery of the Playboy Smex factory. Peter couldn't attack Paul. He was gone, so he turned his wrath onto Hefner. Hefner literally had a stroke on March 7, 1985, at the age of 58 over the allegations. There was plenty of blame to go around. Hefner didn't appreciate this and held news conferences and gave interviews pointing out that it was Dorothy's affair with Bogdanovich that pushed Snider over the edge, not her work in Playboy. He had a bad feeling about their affair and how Snider would respond to the Hollywood director stealing his wife. On April 1st, 1985, Hefner held a press conference at the mansion where he accused Bogdanovich of seducing Dorothy's mother, Nellie, breaking up Nellie's marriage, of seducing Dorothy's sister, Louise, and for the first time when Louise was just 13, and of subjecting Louise to plastic surgery so that she may look more like his dead beloved. Colleen Camp denied the accusations. Peter thought that because Dorothy had died tragically, he was responsible for her whole family. He had Nellie and Louise living with him in Bel Air. He was getting them French lessons, okay? I said to him, Peter, this is not a good idea. This does not look good. But he felt they needed to be taken care of, and he was oblivious as to how it looked. Peter thought he was in a Greek myth. One day he turned to me and said, I'm destined to be with Louise. I'm going to marry her when she's 18. And look, there's no possible way in a billion years that Peter was sleeping with Nellie. I know his type, and yes, he did get Louise surgery, but not a nose job or anything. It was dental surgery. Her jaw was out of alignment. Dorothy's mother and sister got into the act and filed a $5 million lawsuit against Hefner through their attorney, Gloria Allred, for libel and slander, hotly denying there was anything between the little sister and the big shot director turned author. Hefner insisted that it was actually Bogdanovich who was behind the lawsuit. The charges were eventually dropped 6 months later. Around the same time, Bogdanovich issued an apology. All of us who love Dorothy, and I know Hugh Hefner was one of these, have been through the roughest of times. He didn't have the energy to take on Hefner or the money. Los Angeles police said they investigated the allegations that Bogdanovich had sex with the girl last summer, talked with the alleged victim and her parents as part of the probe, but decided not to file charges. In 1988, he married Louise, 20, the same age that Shepard was when he fell in love with her, that Dorothy was when he fell in love with her. The turn of events put off most people. It seemed as if Peter was unable to move on from Dorothy and just wanted to be with her in any sick way he could. No one gave the marriage more than a year. They were wrong. The two remained married for 11 years, but Bogdanovich never regained the stature in Hollywood that he once enjoyed before Dorothy's unaliving. The couple eventually divorced in 2001. When Peter Bogdanovich died in 2022, he was placed to rest for all eternity right next to Dorothy Stratten's resting place. There's no way Dorothy loved Peter the way Peter loved Dorothy, said Mickey Garcia. He was obsessed with her. Dorothy was so nice and so kind and so compassionate, so likable. But she had ambition. She wanted to break into movies. She knew he was a great director. Garcia sighed, shaking his head. Now he's buried right next to her. That's very disturbing the way Dorothy fought for freedom from these men, but in each their own way, they found a way to maintain power over her forever. If any woman learns anything from Dorothy's story, it's this: stop being nice. Dorothy always wanted to end things in a nice way and to remain friends with everyone. None of these men were her friends. They wanted her for their own use, and deep down she knew that. Don't care about people who don't care about you. And don't meet for one last time. Closure is overrated. And just maybe you won't end up the way Dorothy Stratten did. Thank you for listening. And I apologize ahead of time for background noises from my dog snoring and my cat jumping on me. They're big brats.